You are a joke. Do not ever embarrass me again. My own daughter screamed those words, tearing my $5,000 check into pieces and throwing them at my chest. 50 wealthy guests pointed and laughed. I stood perfectly still. The very next morning she smirked and told me to know my place in her world. But a few weeks later, when her high-priced lawyer burst through the doors, trembling and gasping for air, she finally realized the catastrophic mistake she had made. My name is Milton Hayes. I am 68 years old. I am a retired construction contractor and a widower who spent my entire life building a secure future for my family. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my ungrateful daughter's fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who took your unconditional love for granted and treated you like dirt. It was a Saturday night in late October. The venue was the most exclusive and expensive restaurant in the city, rented out completely for the 10th wedding anniversary of my daughter Jada and her husband Bradley. Bradley was a white man who ran a tech startup. He always wore custom-tailored suits that cost more than my first truck. He carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him everything simply because he existed. Jada had adopted his lifestyle completely. She was draped in a designer gown, wearing diamonds that caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above us. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, while waiters in white gloves walked around carrying silver trays of imported champagne and caviar. I stood quietly in the back of the room wearing a clean but simple dark suit I had bought 10 years ago. I felt entirely out of place in that sea of extreme wealth, but I was there out of pure fatherly love. I held my anniversary gift tightly in my hands. I had spent weeks preparing it. It was a handcrafted leather photo album filled with pictures of Jada growing up, pictures of her with her late mother Loretta, and precious memories of a time when we were a real loving family. Inside the front cover, I tucked a cashier's check for $5,000. I knew they lived a lavish life, but $5,000 was a lot of money for a retired working man. It was a gesture of my enduring support and blessing. When the speeches began, Bradley's father gave a boastful toast about corporate success and high society pedigree. The crowd cheered and raised their glasses. I felt a surge of pride for my daughter and decided it was my turn to show my love. I walked up to the small stage at the front of the dining room. I took the microphone. The room grew quiet, though a few of Bradley's friends whispered and snickered at my modest appearance. I spoke straight from the heart. I told them how proud I was of the woman Jada had become. I talked about how much her mother Loretta would have loved to see this beautiful celebration. I held out the leather album and the envelope containing the check. I expected a warm smile. I expected a hug from the little girl I had raised. Instead, Jada stormed up to the stage. Her face was twisted in pure, unadulterated fury. Her heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor. She snatched the microphone from my hand so aggressively that her diamond rings scraped against the metal, sending a loud screech echoing through the elegant dining room. She grabbed the leather album from my hands, looked at the priceless family photos inside with absolute disgust, and tossed the book onto a nearby table like it was garbage. Then she opened the envelope and looked at the check. $5,000. To a man who worked with his hands, it was a small fortune. To Jada and her supposedly wealthy husband, it was a public humiliation. She thought my modest gift exposed her true roots. She thought it made her look cheap and poor in front of her high society friends. She ripped the check right down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper silenced the entire room. She put the pieces together and ripped them again. Then she threw the shredded paper directly at my chest. The pieces fluttered down to the polished marble floor. "You are a joke," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Her cruel words echoed through the silent room. "Do not ever embarrass me again in front of my friends. Keep your pathetic handouts to yourself." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, quickly followed by cruel, muffled laughter from Bradley's family table. I looked over at my son-in-law. Bradley was leaning back in his chair, swirling his whiskey glass, sporting a highly punchable smirk. He did not intervene. He did not defend his father-in-law. He thoroughly enjoyed the show. He enjoyed seeing the old man put in his place. I stood frozen on the stage. The laughter and the mocking whispers felt like physical blows striking my chest. I looked down at my hands. They were thick, heavily calloused, and covered in tiny scars from decades of brutal labor. My mind instantly transported me back in time. I remembered waking up at 4 in the morning, day after day, year after year. I remembered pulling heavy electrical cables in freezing rain and blistering summer heat until my joints screamed in agony. I remembered my sweet Loretta waking up with me in the dark, packing my lunch in a worn-out cooler, kissing my cheek and telling me how proud she was of my hard work. Every drop of sweat I shed, every aching muscle I endured was entirely for Jada. I destroyed my back and my knees so I could pay the exorbitant tuition for her elite private schools. Loretta sewed her own clothes for years just so Jada could wear the latest fashions and fit in with the wealthy kids. We wanted her to sit in rooms exactly like this one. We wanted her to speak eloquently, to understand fine dining, to never have to worry about the electric bill or the mortgage. I sacrificed every comfort in my own life so she would never have to face the struggles I faced. And this was my reward. She used the very education and status I bought with my blood and sweat to look down on me. She viewed my honest labor as a dirty stain on her perfect plastic life. She preferred the hollow validation of strangers over the unconditional love of the father who built the very foundation she was currently standing on. The sheer audacity of her ungratefulness was staggering. She was a woman drowning in a sea of fake luxury, completely blind to the real value of family and sacrifice. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were waiting for my reaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to argue, to raise my voice, to create an angry scene that would only prove their prejudiced assumptions about me. Jada stood there with her arms crossed, glaring at me, daring me to speak. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not attempt to explain the value of the money or the deep sentiment behind the photographs. I simply looked my daughter right in the eye. I looked past the expensive makeup and the sparkling diamond necklace, and I saw a total stranger. I saw a hollow, greedy shell of the little girl I had raised. I slowly turned around and walked down the steps of the stage. I walked through the crowd. The wealthy guests parted for me as if I carried a contagious disease. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. I walked to my truck in absolute silence. But that silence was not submission. It was not defeat. It was the terrifying, cold, calculating quiet of a father who realized his job was no longer to protect his child. My job was to teach her a harsh lesson she would never forget. The spark of punishment had just been lit, and I was going to let her burn her own life to the ground. The morning sun pierced through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor I had laid with my own hands 3 decades ago. I sat at the oak dining table, staring at a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The humiliation from the previous night still burned in my chest, a dull, throbbing ache that refused to subside. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jada ripping that check, hearing the cruel laughter of Bradley's wealthy friends echoing in my ears. I was trying to process the magnitude of her betrayal when the heavy thud of the front door swinging open shattered the quiet morning. They did not knock. They did not ring the doorbell. Heavy footsteps stomped down the hallway. Jada and Bradley marched into my kitchen with the entitled swagger of conquering generals invading a surrendered territory. Bradley was wearing a crisp navy polo shirt and expensive loafers, his face set in a hard, arrogant line. Jada walked right beside him, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder, her chin raised high. She looked around my kitchen, wrinkling her nose as if the very air inside my house offended her. There was no apology in her eyes. There was no remorse for the public crucifixion she had subjected me to just 12 hours earlier. Instead, she looked at me with a cold, calculated disdain. "You should have stayed home last night, old man." She sneered, her voice completely devoid of any daughterly affection. "You embarrassed me in front of my investors. You embarrassed Bradley. And now we are going to establish some ground rules about how things are going to work from this day forward." I remained seated. I did not offer them a chair. I did not offer them coffee. I simply looked at them, my face an unreadable mask, waiting for the axe to fall. Bradley stepped forward, slapping a thick manila folder onto the center of my dining table. The heavy thwack of the paper against the wood sounded like a gavel dropping in a courtroom. He leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the surface, trying to physically intimidate me with his presence. "We are done playing nice, Milton," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can just show up to my events and act like you belong in our world? You do not. You are a relic. You are a liability to our image." Jada crossed her arms, nodding in agreement with every poisonous word spilling from her husband's mouth. I opened the folder. Bradley continued tapping the top page with his index finger. Inside is a formal notice. Effective immediately, you are no longer living here rent-free. If you want to continue occupying this property, you will pay us $3,000 a month. The first payment is due in exactly 5 days. If you fail to pay, we will initiate formal eviction proceedings and throw you out on the street. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of his demand. Pay rent. For the house I bought, for the home where I raised my child, for the walls I built with my own sweat and blood. "This is my house," I said, my voice low and steady, refusing to let them see the shock vibrating through my veins. Bradley let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked at Jada, sharing a look of absolute triumph before turning his cold, pale eyes back to me. "Not anymore, Milton. This house belongs to me." Jada stepped forward, resting a hand on Bradley's shoulder, completely unified with him in this monstrous act. "You really need to learn your place," she said, her tone patronizing as if she were speaking to a slow child. "You are living in our property now. We are the legal owners. We let you stay here out of the goodness of our hearts, but after your little stunt last night, that charity is over. Pay the rent or pack your bags." I looked down at the document spilling out of the manila folder. There was a formal notice to pay rent or quit, but beneath it was a copy of a property deed, a quitclaim deed transferring the entire property rights from Milton Hayes to Bradley and Jada. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon tracing down to the bottom of the page. Right there at the bottom right corner was my signature. It was not forged. It was not a digital copy. It was my authentic handwriting executed with the slightly shaky stroke of a man drowning in unfathomable grief. I stared at the black ink of my own name, and instantly a memory hit me with the force of a freight train. It was a memory I had tried to bury, a memory from the darkest day of my entire existence. It was the day my beautiful Loretta passed away. I remembered the sterile smell of the hospital room. I remembered the agonizing, steady beep of the heart monitor slowing down, fading into the terrifying flatline that signaled the end of my 40-year marriage. I remembered sitting beside her lifeless body, my world completely shattered, my heart torn into a million irreparable pieces. I was blinded by tears. I could not breathe. I could not think. And in that moment of absolute paralyzing vulnerability, Jada had walked into the room. She had a clipboard in her hands. She placed her hand on my shaking shoulder, her voice sounding so gentle, so comforting at the time. "Daddy," she had whispered, wiping a tear from my cheek. "The hospital administration needs you to sign these release forms. It is just for the medical bills and the funeral home transfer. You do not need to read them right now. Just sign here, and I will handle all the terrible details for you." I was so broken. I trusted my only daughter completely. I took the pen she handed me and signed exactly where she pointed, desperate to get the bureaucratic nightmare over with so I could mourn my wife. She had weaponized my grief. While I was weeping over her mother's corpse, Jada had slipped a quitclaim deed into the stack of hospital papers. She had stolen the roof over my head while my tears were actively falling onto the pages. The sheer, unadulterated evil of that act made my blood run cold. She had not just stolen a piece of real estate. She had violated the sanctity of her mother's death to line her own pockets. "You have 5 days, old man," Bradley barked, breaking me out of my horrifying realization. $3,000 or the sheriff will come throw your belongings onto the front lawn. Do not test me. I have the law on my side. Jada picked up her designer purse, her face a mask of absolute indifference. "Consider this your final warning," she said. They turned around and marched out of my house, leaving the front door wide open behind them. I heard the engine of Bradley's luxury SUV roar to life in the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel as they sped away. I sat in the silent kitchen for a long time. I did not scream. I did not throw my coffee cup against the wall. Panic and anger are the weapons of the weak. I was not weak. I was a man who had spent 40 years constructing solid foundations, and I knew exactly how to dismantle a structure from the ground up. The shock had completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, deadly focus. I calmly closed the manila folder. I stood up, walked over to the hallway hook, and grabbed the keys to my truck. They thought they had outsmarted a naive, senile old man. They thought a piece of paper signed under duress gave them ultimate power. They were wrong. I walked out the door and locked it behind me. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, gripping the steering wheel. The silence was over. The investigation had officially begun. I put the truck into gear and drove straight toward the county clerk's office. It was time to follow the trail of the devil. The drive to the county clerk's office was a blur of gray asphalt and glaring traffic lights. I kept my hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel of my truck, my posture rigid and my breathing controlled. There was absolutely no room for sorrow today. Sorrow is a luxury for people who are not actively under attack. For 40 years in the commercial construction business, I learned to detach my personal emotions from the structural problem right in front of me. When a load-bearing wall is severely compromised, you do not sit down in the dirt and cry about the cracked drywall. You assess the total structural damage, you gather your heavy tools, and you systematically reinforce the foundation before the entire building collapses on your head. Right now, Jada and Bradley were enthusiastically swinging a sledgehammer at the financial foundation of my life, and I needed to inspect the exact extent of the damage. I navigated through the bustling downtown traffic, my mind operating with cold, mechanical precision. The air inside the truck cabin was completely still. I kept the radio turned off. I did not need background noise or distracting music. I needed absolute crystalline focus. I parked my truck in the municipal lot directly across from the courthouse feeding quarters into the parking meter with steady, unshakable hands. The county records building was an imposing structure made of heavy limestone and thick reinforced glass, a clinical place where entire lives were reduced to ink and stamped paper. I walked through the metal detectors at the entrance, emptied my pockets into the plastic security bins, and retrieved my belongings with the practiced efficiency of a man on a mission. I followed the faded blue signs pointing toward the Register of Deeds office down a long, echoing corridor. The large room smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and bureaucratic apathy. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum that matched the tension in my jaw. I pulled a paper ticket from the red mechanical dispenser and waited for my number to be called. I sat on a hard wooden bench watching the various clerks shuffle thick files and stamp legal documents. Every passing second felt like a grueling hour, but my patience was infinite. Finally, the digital screen above the counter flashed my assigned number. I approached window number 4. Behind the thick, smudged plexiglass sat a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a plastic name tag that read, Brenda. "How can I help you today, sir?" she asked in a monotonous voice, not even bothering to look up from her computer keyboard. "I need to pull the complete property history and all recent filings for my home address," I said, sliding my driver's license across the scratched counter. Brenda took my license, typed my address into her database, and clicked her computer mouse a few times. Her eyes scanned the glowing monitor. "You are looking for the deed history for the residential property on Oakwood Drive," she confirmed in a flat tone. I nodded once. She hit print, and the heavy industrial printer behind her groaned to life, spitting out several pages of dense legal documents. She gathered the warm papers, stapled them together, and slid them under the plexiglass slot. I picked them up. My eyes immediately bypassed the original warranty deed from 30 years ago and zeroed in on the most recent filing at the very top of the stack. There it was, the quitclaim deed. It had been officially recorded by the county just 3 days after Loretta's funeral. I studied the document with the intense scrutiny of a master contractor inspecting a fundamentally flawed architectural blueprint. The physical signature at the bottom was definitely mine. I instantly recognized the slight tremor in the blue ink, the undeniable mark of my grief-stricken hand from that terrible day in the sterile hospital room. But the rest of the document was a masterpiece of calculated, malicious deception. The legal description of the property had been meticulously typed out to transfer sole ownership to Bradley and Jada. But what caught my immediate burning attention was the notary public section on the second page. To make a real estate deed transfer legal, and binding estate certified notary must physically witness the signature and verify the identity of the signer with a government-issued ID. I looked closely at the black ink of the notary stamp. It belonged to a man named Richard Vance. I did not know anyone named Richard Vance. There was absolutely no notary present in that hospital room when Jada handed me those release papers. She had taken my vulnerable signature, walked out of the hospital, and had someone in Bradley's shady network illegally stamp and seal the document well after the fact. It was a completely fraudulent notarization. They had planned this aggressive takeover down to the very last detail. Jada knew exactly what she was doing when she preyed on my emotional devastation. She had prepared the property transfer document in advance, brought it to the hospital while her mother was dying, and had a corrupt associate legitimize it behind closed doors. They stole the property right out from under me, stripping away decades of my hard-earned equity in a matter of seconds. I felt a massive surge of disgust radiate through my body. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a highly sophisticated, premeditated felony. I ran my calloused finger over the embossed notary seal, my jaw tightening until my teeth ached. They had effectively and legally erased me from my own property. I was nothing more than an unwanted tenant in the eyes of the county law. I looked up at Brenda, who was already preparing to press the button to call the next number in the waiting room. "Wait," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and authoritative. "I need you to check something else for me. Are there any other encumbrances currently active on this property? Any new liens or recent loans attached to this specific deed?" Brenda sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by the extra work, and turned back to her computer monitor. She typed for a few seconds. The bright screen reflected in her glasses. "Yes," she said casually, as if she were reading items off a grocery list. "There is a new deed of trust recorded against the property. It looks like the current legal owners took out a home equity line of credit. AHELOC. I froze. The blood drained from my face. A home equity line of credit. When exactly was this recorded? I asked, my heart rate accelerating rapidly. Brenda squinted at the digital screen, tracing the line with her finger. "Just last Thursday. The revolving line of credit is for $500,000. The records indicate the funds were fully dispersed immediately upon closing. The primary lender is a commercial bank located out of state." I stared at her through the thick plexiglass, the massive magnitude of the revelation hitting me like a physical blow to the stomach. $500,000. They did not just steal my house to own a piece of real estate. They did not steal it just to force me to pay exorbitant rent. The rent demand this morning was just a cruel distraction, a sadistic game to assert their dominance over me. The real motive was the massive equity I had built up over 40 years. They had used my home, a beautiful house completely paid off without a single dime of debt, as collateral to extract $500,000 in cold, hard cash. If they defaulted on that massive loan, the bank would immediately foreclose on the house, and I would be violently thrown onto the street anyway. My entire life's work had been secretly converted into a massive cash payout for Bradley and Jada. I thanked Brenda, gathered the heavy stack of legal papers, and walked out of the county office. The bright afternoon sun hit my face, but I felt freezing cold inside. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifying, but they did not make logical sense to me. Bradley drove a customized luxury car. He constantly bragged about his booming tech company and his massive venture capital funding. Jada wore imported designer clothes and threw lavish, expensive parties. They projected an impenetrable image of limitless wealth and elite status. So why did they desperately need $500,000 in liquid cash so fast? Why resort to a highly illegal, risky federal felony like real estate forgery just to secure a bank loan? People with real sustainable money do not commit blatant fraud for a home equity line. They only do that when they are desperately drowning. Something was rotting violently beneath the polished surface of their perfect plastic lives. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed a private number I had not used in years. It belonged to an old trusted friend, a former police detective who now worked as an elite private investigator. The phone rang twice before he answered with a gruff greeting. "We need to talk immediately," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "I have a high-stakes job for you, and I need you to dig deeper than you have ever dug before." I met him 3 days later at a rundown diner on the industrial side of town, miles away from the polished glass buildings and valet parking of Bradley's pretentious world. Arthur was a man who spoke little but saw absolutely everything. He was a retired police detective I had known for over 20 years, a man who now made his living unearthing the filthy secrets that wealthy people tried desperately to bury. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, ordering a black coffee before tossing a heavy, thick manila folder onto the formica table. It landed with a heavy thud, perfectly echoing the gravity of its contents. "You were right to call me, Milton," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the clatter of the diner. "I dug into your son-in-law and your daughter. I followed the money trail exactly like you asked. What I found is ugly. Really ugly. It took a lot of late nights and calling in some heavy favors from my old buddies in the financial crimes division, but the entire picture is crystal clear now. I picked up the folder, feeling the physical weight of the secrets inside. "Give it to me straight, Arthur," I said, opening the cover. "Do not sugarcoat a single word." Arthur leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. "They are broke, Milton. They are not just temporarily out of cash. They are drowning in a financial abyss so deep it is an absolute miracle they are not already sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial." I flipped through the first few pages of the dossier. There were highlighted bank statements, redacted court filings, and blurry surveillance photos of Bradley meeting with very unsavory-looking individuals in dimly lit parking garages. The pristine, untouchable image of their high society life began to violently dissolve right before my eyes, replaced by a terrifying reality of desperate criminal survival. "Let us start with Bradley." Arthur continued, pointing a thick finger at a spreadsheet filled entirely with red numbers. "That fancy tech startup he never stops bragging about. The one that supposedly secured massive venture capital funding. It is a complete mirage. There is no revolutionary software product. There is no groundbreaking code being developed. It is nothing more than a classic textbook Ponzi scheme dressed up in Silicon Valley buzzwords and expensive tailored suits. He has been aggressively taking millions of dollars from new, unsuspecting investors and illegally using those funds to pay off the early investors, manufacturing the illusion of massive profits. All the while, he has been skimming a massive percentage right off the top to fund his ridiculous luxury lifestyle." I stared at the financial charts, the sickening reality fully sinking in. "How close is it to collapsing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has already collapsed," Arthur replied grimly. "The new money completely stopped flowing in about 6 months ago. Now the early investors are aggressively demanding their returns. The primary venture capital firm that backed him initially has initiated a highly aggressive forensic audit. He is currently facing multiple civil lawsuits for breach of fiduciary duty. But worse than that, Milton Bradley borrowed a significant amount of off-the-books cash from some very dangerous private lenders to keep the illusion afloat when the institutional money dried up. Those private lenders do not send polite collection letters through the mail. They send violent men who break kneecaps and threaten families. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped into place. That explained the sheer desperation. That explained the extreme urgency of stealing my home right out from under me. Bradley was utterly terrified. He needed an immediate, massive influx of liquid cash to hold off the violent creditors breathing down his neck and to delay the inevitable federal indictment from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The $500,000 he illegally extracted from my house equity was not going toward any legitimate business venture. It was hush money. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to plug a massive hole in a rapidly sinking ship. He had literally stolen my life savings, the equity I built with 40 years of broken skin and aching bones, to buy himself a few more months of freedom before the FBI inevitably kicked down his office door. He was a cornered rat, willing to absolutely destroy his own father-in-law to save his own skin. "And what about Jada?" I asked, dreading the answer, but needing to know the complete truth about my own flesh and blood. Was she just blindly following him, or did she know? Arthur flipped to the second heavy section of the dossier. "Your daughter is not a victim in this, Milton. She is a full, willing, and active participant. In fact, her reckless vanity is what rapidly accelerated their entire financial downfall." He laid out a thick stack of credit card statements across the table. There were over 15 different premium credit cards, every single one of them maxed out to the absolute limit and severely past due. Jada has racked up nearly $200,000 in consumer debt just in the last year and a half, Arthur explained, tapping the paper. Designer clothes, imported luxury vehicles, first-class trips to Europe, and massive tabs at exclusive downtown restaurants. She is absolutely obsessed with portraying the flawless image of a billionaire socialite on the internet. She would rather burn her entire life to the ground than admit to her wealthy friends that she is completely broke. I looked at a specific receipt from the very restaurant where they held their 10th anniversary party just a few weeks ago. The bill was exorbitant, and it had been charged to a high-interest credit card that was already flagged for severe delinquency. The entire anniversary celebration, the string quartet, the expensive caviar, the mocking laughs of her wealthy friends when she tore up my honest check, it was all entirely funded by phantom money. They were putting on a grand theatrical play of success while their actual house was completely engulfed in flames. They missed the last 3 rent payments on their luxury apartment downtown. Arthur added, sliding an official eviction warning notice across the table. They stole your house because they literally have nowhere else to go. They took the $500,000 from your equity to pay off Bradley's most violent lenders and to keep up the bare minimum monthly payments on Jada's credit card so her rich friends would not suspect a single thing. They are financial parasites, Milton. They are living a completely fabricated lie, and they are completely, totally bankrupt. I closed the heavy folder, running my calloused hands over the smooth manila cover. The shock was completely gone. The lingering fatherly sorrow I held onto had totally evaporated. The rage inside me had crystallized into something incredibly sharp, cold, and profoundly dangerous. I thanked Arthur, paid his substantial invoice entirely in cash, and walked out of the diner back to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat, staring out at the empty industrial street, methodically processing the absolute moral bankruptcy of my daughter and her husband. They had casually traded my lifetime of honest, backbreaking labor for a cheap, temporary illusion of status. They had weaponized my grief over my dead wife to fund their fraudulent existence. I gripped the steering wheel, a dark, calculating calm washing over my entire body. I knew exactly what I had to do. Suddenly, the tense silence in the truck cabin was violently broken by the sharp, melodic ring of my cell phone. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was Jada. I took a deep, steadying breath, clearing my throat to ensure my voice gave absolutely nothing away, and pressed the answer button. "Daddy," she said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, artificial affection that I now knew was completely manufactured. "I am so sorry about our little disagreement the other day. Bradley and I feel just terrible about how things escalated between us. We really want to make things right with you. We would love to invite you to a nice private dinner tonight at our place to reconcile and talk peacefully about our future together." I stared blankly at the truck dashboard, a cold, predatory smile slowly creeping across my face. I was fully aware that a cornered, desperate predator does not suddenly invite you to dinner to apologize. They invite you to dinner because they are actively setting a brand new, deadly trap. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and warm. "I would love to come to dinner." I hung up the phone. The true game had just begun. 2 hours after that phone call, Jada sent a text message changing the location. She claimed their luxury apartment was a mess and insisted we meet at an upscale, dimly lit restaurant downtown. I knew the real reason. Their apartment was likely being packed up or already facing lockouts from unpaid rent. They needed a public, sophisticated setting to maintain their desperate illusion of wealth and to corner me in a place where I would be too embarrassed to make a scene. I arrived at the restaurant wearing the same modest suit from the anniversary party. The maitre d' led me to a private booth in the back. Jada and Bradley were already seated. They had ordered a bottle of expensive red wine, no doubt charging it to another maxed-out credit card. As I sat down, the hostility from the morning was completely gone, replaced by a suffocating, manufactured warmth. Bradley actually stood up to shake my hand, flashing a bright, perfectly rehearsed smile. Jada reached across the table, placing her manicured hand over my rough knuckles. "Daddy, it is so good to see you," she purred, her voice dripping with fake honey. "We want to apologize again for this morning. Emotions were running high. We were stressed about work and we took it out on you. That was completely unacceptable." I nodded slowly, withdrawing my hand from hers. I ordered a simple glass of water and a steak, deciding to let them play out their little theatrical performance. For the first 30 minutes, the conversation was sickeningly sweet. They asked about my days, they talked about the weather, and then slowly, Jada began to steer the ship toward her true objective. She tilted her head, her eyes wide with exaggerated theatrical concern. "Daddy, Bradley and I have been talking, and we are just so worried about your health. You have been through so much trauma since Mom passed away. You are getting older. The stress of managing a big house and dealing with daily responsibilities is clearly taking a massive toll on your mind. You have been acting very confused lately." I chewed my food methodically, staring straight into her lying eyes. "I am not confused about anything, Jada. My mind is sharper than it has ever been." Bradley chimed in, leaning forward with a deeply fake expression of sympathy. "Milton, we love you. But we have noticed the signs. You are forgetting things. You are becoming agitated over nothing. The outburst last night, the tension this morning. It is classic cognitive decline. We just want to make sure you are safe and protected." The waiter cleared our plates. The moment the table was empty, the real agenda was finally unveiled. Jada reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. She slid the packet across the crisp white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the bold, capitalized letters printed at the top of the very first page. It read, "Medical evaluation of mental capacity and voluntary consent for legal conservatorship." I stared at the black ink, feeling a surge of absolute disgust. A conservatorship. They were not just trying to steal my house, they were trying to legally strip me of my fundamental human rights. They wanted a judge to declare me mentally incompetent so they could seize total control over my bank accounts, my medical decisions, and every single asset tied to my name. It was the ultimate horrific betrayal. "Just read it over." "Daddy," Jada said, softly tapping the signature line with a silver luxury pen she had placed next to the packet. "It is just a standard medical and legal protocol. It allows Bradley and me to take over all your financial burdens. You will not have to worry about paying bills, managing property, or dealing with stressful administrative tasks ever again. You can just relax and let us handle your life. We have a doctor standing by who will sign off on the evaluation with no hassle. All you have to do is sign your name on the bottom line and we will take care of absolutely everything." I picked up the document. I read the clauses carefully. The language was ruthlessly comprehensive. By signing this paper, I would be legally declaring myself unfit to manage my own affairs. I would be handing Bradley the universal power of attorney. He would have the legal authority to empty my bank accounts, sell my vehicles, intercept my mail, and completely dictate where I lived. They needed this signature desperately. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was just a temporary bandage on their massive financial hemorrhage. A conservatorship would give them a permanent legal pipeline to drain every last drop of my life savings to pay off their dangerous creditors. I placed the document back on the table. I picked up the silver pen, looked at it for a moment, and then calmly set it down just out of Jada's reach. "I will not sign this," I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute finality. "I am completely sane. I manage my own finances perfectly. I do not need a conservator, and I certainly do not need either of you managing a single dime of my money." The suffocating fake warmth in the booth vanished instantly. The temperature at the table dropped to absolute zero. Jada's patronizing smile morphed into a hard, furious scowl. Bradley's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his fist down on the table, rattling the expensive wine glasses. The polite good son-in-law act was officially dead. The desperate, cornered animal had finally breached the surface. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," Bradley hissed, leaning so far over the table I could smell the expensive wine on his breath. "You are going to sign that paper right now. You do not have a choice in this matter. Do you understand me? I own the roof over your head. I own the dirt beneath your boots. If you sign this conservatorship and give us legal control of your assets, we will let you live quietly in the basement of the house. We will bring you meals. We will let you exist in peace." Bradley pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face. "But if you refuse to sign, I will make your life a living hell. I will serve you with a formal eviction notice tomorrow morning. I will have the sheriff drag you out of that house by your collar. And because you have no other place to go, I will use my authority as your legal landlord to report you to the state as a homeless, incapable senior citizen. Do you know what happens to stubborn old men with no home and no family willing to take them in? The state ships you off to a decrepit, underfunded public hospice facility. You will spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a crowded room that smells like bleach and urine, surrounded by people who do not even know their own names. You will die alone, and the state will bury you in an unmarked grave." The sheer malice in his threat was staggering. He was weaponizing the terrifying reality of elder abuse to force my compliance. He was fully prepared to throw me into a miserable state-run facility just to gain unrestricted access to my bank accounts. I looked at Jada, expecting at least a tiny flicker of hesitation, a single shred of daughterly conscience. There was nothing. Her eyes were completely dead hollow pits of pure, unadulterated greed. She was completely aligned with this monstrous plan. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Bradley with a cold, piercing glare that made him physically swallow hard. "You do not have the power to do any of those things, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You are a weak, desperate man wearing a suit you cannot afford. I will never sign away my life to a pair of parasites. If you want a war, you just declared it. I suggest you brace yourself for the consequences." Jada let out a sharp, venomous laugh. She leaned back in her leather chair, her expression hardening into pure ice. "We tried to do this the easy way, Daddy," she said, her tone completely detached and mechanical. "We really tried to give you a soft landing. But if you want to play hardball, we will play hardball. You brought this entirely on yourself." Without breaking eye contact with me, Jada reached into her purse and pulled out her cell phone. She placed it flat on the table, activated the speakerphone, and tapped a pre-programmed number. The phone rang loudly in the tense silence of the restaurant booth. A professional voice answered on the other end. "Adult Protective Services emergency intake line. How can I direct your call?" Jada's entire demeanor shifted in a split second. She let out a sudden, perfectly manufactured sob. Her voice began to tremble violently, adopting the desperate, panicked tone of a terrified daughter. "Hello?" she cried into the phone, covering her mouth with her hand for dramatic effect. "I need immediate emergency assistance. I am calling about my elderly father, Milton Hayes. He is suffering from severe advanced dementia, and he is having a violent psychological breakdown." The operator immediately shifted to an urgent tone. "Ma'am, please stay calm. Is he a danger to himself or others?" "Yes," Jada wept, squeezing out a fake tear that rolled down her perfectly powdered cheek. "He is highly aggressive. He is experiencing extreme delusions. He thinks people are trying to steal from him. He is refusing his medication, and he is completely incapable of caring for himself safely. He is living in my property, and I am absolutely terrified he is going to burn the house down or hurt someone. You have to send an intervention team to his address immediately before a tragedy happens. Please help us." She gave the operator my exact home address. The operator assured her that an emergency response team would be dispatched to conduct a mandatory wellness check and psychiatric evaluation first thing in the morning. Jada thanked the operator with a shaky, grateful voice and ended the call. The moment the screen went black, the fake tears instantly vanished. Her face returned to a cold, triumphant smirk. "The state intervention team will be at your door at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," she said, sliding her phone back into her purse. "They do not take reports of violent, delusional seniors lightly. They will interrogate you. They will evaluate your mental state. And when you inevitably get angry and defensive, you will prove my exact point for me. They will place you under a mandatory psychiatric hold, and a judge will grant me emergency guardianship before the weekend is over. You lose, old man." I looked at the two monsters sitting across from me. They had orchestrated a flawless, horrific trap. They were using the very government agencies designed to protect the elderly as a weapon to destroy me. I picked up my napkin, wiped my mouth calmly, and tossed it onto the table over their worthless legal documents. I slid out of the booth and stood tall, looking down at them with absolute unwavering resolve. I did not say another word. I turned around and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them at the table. Tomorrow morning, the true battle would begin, and I was going to be more than ready for the knock on my door. The morning sun pierced through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor I had laid with my own hands 3 decades ago. I woke up at 5 in the morning, my internal clock functioning with the same rigorous discipline it had for 4 decades. I showered, shaved carefully, and dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and pressed slacks. If the state was coming to evaluate my mental competence and my ability to care for myself, I was going to present them with a man who was sharper and more put together than the people who sent them. I spent the next hour ensuring the house was absolutely immaculate. Every surface was wiped down, the floors were spotless, and the smell of freshly brewed, high-quality coffee filled the air. I arranged my dining room table with the precision of a boardroom meeting. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued. I was a tactician preparing for an audit. At exactly 8 o'clock, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the front hallway. I walked to the door, my posture perfectly straight, and pulled it open. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing a professional gray blazer and a tense expression, stood on my porch. She gripped a heavy clipboard tight against her chest like a physical shield. Standing just 2 steps behind her was a uniformed city police officer, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. Jada had clearly emphasized the violent and unpredictable part of her fabricated story. They were fully expecting a combative, deranged old man ready to tear the house apart. "Good morning," I said, my voice rich, calm, and welcoming. "You must be the representatives from Adult Protective Services. Please come inside. It is a bit chilly out there." The woman blinked, clearly thrown off balance by my polite, lucid greeting. She exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with the police officer before stepping into the foyer. "I am Ms. Higgins," she said, her voice carrying a cautious edge. "We received an emergency hotline call last night regarding your welfare, Mr. Hayes. We need to conduct a mandatory wellness check and ask you a few questions." "I understand completely, Ms. Higgins," I replied, gesturing toward the dining room. "You are just doing your job. I have a fresh pot of coffee brewing. Would you or the officer care for a cup before we sit down?" The police officer visibly relaxed his shoulders, shaking his head with a polite smile. Miss Higgins politely declined the coffee but followed me to the dining table. She sat down, her eyes scanning the immaculate room, noting the total absence of the chaos she had been briefed to expect. She clicked her pen, adopting a clinical evaluative tone. "Mr. Hayes, do you know what day it is? Do you know who the current president is? Can you tell me your date of birth and your exact address?" I sat across from her, folding my hands neatly on the oak table. I answered every single standard cognitive question flawlessly, without a moment of hesitation. I spoke with the articulate, measured cadence of a man who was entirely grounded in reality. I saw the tension completely leave Ms. Higgins's body. The defensive grip on her clipboard loosened. She realized very quickly that the person sitting across from her was not suffering from advanced dementia. "My daughter called you last night," I stated, not asking a question, but delivering a fact. "She told you I was delusional, aggressive, and unable to care for myself. She likely told you I was paranoid and hallucinating about people trying to steal my money." Ms. Higgins shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Our reports are strictly confidential, Mr. Hayes, but I can confirm the caller expressed extreme concern about severe cognitive decline and paranoia regarding financial theft." I nodded slowly. I reached under the table and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized 3-ring binder I had assembled during the early hours of the morning. I slid it across the smooth wood toward her. "I am not hallucinating, Ms. Higgins, and I am certainly not paranoid. I am simply a man whose daughter and son-in-law are attempting to orchestrate a massive, sophisticated financial fraud against him." She opened the binder. The very first section contained my complete, updated medical records. Just 2 months ago, I underwent a comprehensive physical and neurological exam required to renew my premium life insurance policy. The document, signed by a highly respected board-certified physician, explicitly stated my cognitive functions were flawless and my physical health was excellent. The next section contained my recent bank statements, tax returns, and investment portfolio summaries. Every single page was perfectly organized, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that I independently and successfully managed a highly complex financial life without any assistance whatsoever. Miss Higgins flipped through the pages, her professional skepticism rapidly transforming into genuine shock. "Mr. Hayes, these records are pristine. You are in better administrative shape than most people half your age. But why would your daughter make such a severe fabricated report to a state agency? Filing a false claim to Adult Protective Services is a very serious offense." I pulled out the final document from my own folder. It was the threatening, extortionate rent demand Bradley had slammed onto my table just 24 hours earlier. I placed it directly on top of her clipboard. Because Ms. Higgins, a false psychiatric hold is the easiest way to silence a victim of elder abuse. My daughter and her husband are drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of severe consumer and business debt. 3 days after my wife died, my daughter slipped a fraudulent property transfer document into a stack of hospital release forms while I was weeping over the body. She stole the legal title to this very house. Ms. Higgins gasped, her eyes wide with horror as she read the cruel typed demand for $3,000 a month. The police officer stepped closer to the table, his earlier relaxed demeanor replaced by a sharp professional outrage. "They did not just steal the title," I continued, my voice cold and steady as a steel beam. "Last Thursday, they used the forged deed to illegally extract a $500,000 home equity line of credit from an out-of-state commercial bank. They cashed out the equity I spent 40 years building to pay off violent private lenders and sustain their fraudulent luxury lifestyle. Last night, I refused to sign a voluntary conservatorship that would have handed them total unchecked legal access to the rest of my liquid assets. When I refused to surrender my life to them, my daughter pulled out her phone and called your agency. She weaponized your vital services to have me locked in a psychiatric ward so a judge would grant her emergency guardianship by default." The room was dead silent. The truth hung heavily in the air, a dark, ugly testament to human greed. Ms. Higgins looked at me, her eyes filled with profound sympathy and righteous anger. Mr. Hayes, this is textbook financial exploitation of a senior. It is one of the most malicious, calculated cases I have seen in my entire career. Officer, she said, turning to the policeman, we need to file a formal report for elder abuse and real estate fraud immediately. We can have your daughter and her husband investigated and arrested. I raised my hand gently but firmly, stopping her. I appreciate your dedication, Ms. Higgins, but I must ask you to stand down. I have already retained a private investigator and top-tier corporate legal counsel. We are actively compiling a massive, airtight federal case against them. If local authorities knock on their door today for a simple welfare fraud dispute, they will panic, destroy the financial evidence, and flee the state before the federal bank fraud charges can be locked in. I need them to believe they are winning. I need them to feel safe and confident so they continue to make catastrophic documented mistakes. Ms. Higgins looked at me with deep newfound respect. You are a very strategic man, Mr. Hayes. Are you absolutely certain you are safe remaining in this house with them holding that fraudulent deed? I smiled, a thin, razor-sharp curve of the lips. I am perfectly safe. They only hold power if I allow them to see my hand. I just need you to close this welfare case so they believe their psychiatric trap failed due to a bureaucratic oversight, not because I exposed them. Ms. Higgins closed her clipboard with a decisive snap. Consider the case closed and completely entirely unfounded, Mr. Hayes. I will document that you are of incredibly sound mind, fully independent, and exhibiting zero signs of distress. I will not mention the financial fraud in the official state database to protect your ongoing private investigation. But please be careful. People desperate enough to forge property deeds are desperate enough to do much worse. I thanked her and the officer for their time. I walked them to the front door, shaking their hands before watching them drive away in their unmarked county vehicle. The morning air was crisp and clear. The first major hurdle had been successfully dismantled. Jada's weapon had been completely neutralized. I locked the deadbolt and walked down the hallway toward my home office. The time for defensive maneuvering was officially over. I opened the closet door and pulled down a heavy, dust-covered toolbox from the highest shelf. I carried it to my desk and popped the metal latches. I removed the standard wrenches and screwdrivers, revealing a false bottom panel. I lifted the panel to expose a row of high-tech, ultra-miniature surveillance cameras and audio recording devices I had purchased through Arthur, my private investigator, just 2 days prior. If Jada and Bradley wanted to play dirty games inside my property, I was going to capture every single word, every single transaction, and every single felony they committed in glorious high definition. I picked up the first tiny camera lens, ready to wire the entire house. The hunting season had officially opened. After securing the last hidden camera behind the living room air vent, I washed my hands, locked the front door, and drove out to the one place that always brought me absolute clarity. The Whispering Pines Cemetery was quiet in the late morning light. I walked down the familiar manicured path until I reached a pristine marble headstone resting under the shade of a massive oak tree. Loretta Hayes, beloved wife and mother. I knelt down, brushing a few fallen leaves away from her engraved name. I took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs, and spoke to her in the comforting silence of the graveyard. "I am sorry, my love," I whispered, resting my rough hand against the cool stone. "I tried to protect our daughter. I tried to build a fortress around her, but she invited the wolves right through the front gate. Loretta was the only person in the world who knew the absolute truth about our financial reality. When Jada and her arrogant husband looked at me, they saw a tired old man who spent 40 years pulling electrical cables and laying bricks. They saw a blue-collar worker who barely scraped by. They were incredibly wrong. I did not just work for the construction company. I built it from the ground up, expanded it across 3 state lines, and owned the entire operation. 15 years ago, shortly after Jada went off to college, I sold Hayes Commercial Contracting to a massive national developer. The buyout was staggering. It was the kind of generational wealth that permanently alters family bloodlines. But Loretta and I made a firm, calculated decision that very day. We looked at the children of our wealthy colleagues, kids who grew up with unlimited trust funds and zero work ethic. We saw them become entitled, arrogant, and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. We refused to let that happen to Jada. We wanted her to value the grit of hard work. We wanted to protect her from the manipulative gold diggers and financial predators that instinctively circle rich families. So we intentionally maintained our modest lifestyle. We kept the same 4-bedroom house. I kept driving my reliable domestic trucks. I wore the same simple suits. I let Jada believe we were comfortably middle class, nothing more. I stood up looking down at Loretta's grave with a hardened resolve. My attempt to keep Jada humble had failed entirely, but my strategy to protect our assets was about to execute flawlessly. When the company buyout finalized 15 years ago, I did not just deposit a massive check into a standard savings account. I hired a team of elite wealth management attorneys out of Chicago. They constructed an impenetrable legal fortress designed to shield our wealth from frivolous lawsuits, greedy relatives, and public record searches. They established the Apex Blind Trust. The trust was a completely independent legal entity. I transferred the vast majority of my liquid capital, my stock portfolios, and my real estate holdings directly into it, and that included the very house Jada and Bradley currently believe they had stolen. I smiled, a grim, humorless smile. Jada had waited until I was weeping over her mother's hospital bed to slip that quitclaim deed under my pen. She thought she was executing a masterful, predatory real estate heist. Bradley thought he had secured $500,000 in home equity to save his sinking Ponzi scheme. But their entire criminal conspiracy was built on a monumental, catastrophic legal illusion. I have not been the personal legal owner of that residential property for a decade and a half. The deed belongs exclusively to the Apex Blind Trust. I simply reside there as a primary beneficiary. When Jada forged that notary stamp and filed the property transfer at the county clerk's office, she transferred absolutely nothing. Legally speaking, a quitclaim deed only transfers whatever interest the signer currently holds. Because Milton Hayes personally held zero ownership interest in that property, the deed was worth less than the paper it was printed on. This meant the massive out-of-state commercial bank that issued Bradley his $500,000 line of credit had made a fatal underwriting error. They had relied on a fraudulent, hastily recorded deed without conducting a deep, thorough historical title search. Bradley had actively pledged a highly valuable asset he did not actually own to extract $500,000 in federal funds. The moment the bank's compliance department audited that specific loan, the entire transaction would instantly transform from a civil real estate dispute into a massive, undeniable case of federal bank fraud. Bradley had confidently locked himself inside a burning cage and swallowed the key. But the absolute pinnacle of their impending destruction went far deeper than a single residential property. The Apex Blind Trust did not just let my millions sit idle in mutual funds. The trust's financial managers actively acquired premium commercial real estate across the metropolitan area. It was a strategy designed to generate massive passive wealth for generations to come. I walked back to my truck, the gravel crunching beneath my heavy work boots. I pulled Arthur's investigative dossier from the passenger seat and flipped to the section detailing Bradley's fraudulent tech startup. I looked at the official address of his company headquarters. It was located in a sleek, towering Class A glass and steel commercial high-rise right in the epicenter of the downtown financial district. Bradley frequently boasted about his prestigious corner office on the top floor. He used the expensive address to project an aura of immense success to his gullible investors, justifying the exorbitant overhead costs as a necessary expense for a titan of the tech industry. I stared at the address printed on the page, letting the supreme poetic irony wash over me. That specific commercial high-rise was the absolute crown jewel of my trust's real estate portfolio. The Apex Blind Trust owned the entire building. Every single inch of glass, steel, and concrete belonged to my legal entity, Bradley, the man who arrogantly looked down on my calloused hands, the man who sneered at my clothes and mocked my modest lifestyle, the man who had the absolute audacity to threaten me with eviction and homelessness just 24 hours ago, was literally my tenant. He was operating his fraudulent, crumbling Ponzi scheme inside my property. And according to Arthur's rigorous financial investigation, Bradley was severely delinquent on his commercial lease. He was actively defaulting on his massive rent payments to the very father-in-law he was attempting to destroy. He thought he was a predator hunting a weak, senile old man. In reality, he was a blind, arrogant mouse blindly navigating a massive maze that I personally designed and completely controlled. Every step he took to save himself only tightened the invisible noose around his neck. I did not just hold the high ground, I owned the entire battlefield. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck and slammed the heavy door shut. The silence of the cemetery was deeply comforting, a stark contrast to the explosive chaos I was about to unleash on my ungrateful daughter and her criminal husband. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and found the private number for Mr. Gallagher. Gallagher was not a local family lawyer. He was a ruthless, highly connected corporate litigator based out of a prestigious firm in the city. He was the primary legal architect who managed the aggressive enforcement of the Apex Blind Trust. He was a man who specialized in financially disemboweling corporate adversaries with surgical, terrifying precision. I pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before his crisp, authoritative voice came through the speaker. Mr. Hayes Gallagher answered promptly. "It is good to hear from you. I assume this is not a social call." "You assume correctly, Gallagher," I said, my voice echoing with the cold, immovable weight of absolute authority. "I need you to initiate a full operational strike on a commercial tenant in the downtown high-rise. Prepare an aggressive immediate notice to pay or quit for the top-floor suite. I want the maximum legal pressure applied instantly, and prepare your federal litigation team. We are going to expose a massive case of bank fraud and real estate forgery." "Understood," Sir Gallagher replied, his tone shifting into predatory anticipation. "Shall we begin the preliminary warning process?" I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The tired, grieving widower was completely gone. The titan of industry had returned to collect his due. "No warnings," I stated firmly. "It is time to pull the net." I drove straight from the quiet peace of the cemetery into the chaotic heart of the city financial district. I completely bypassed the towering glass structure that housed Bradley's failing technology company and pulled my truck into the secured underground parking garage of a heavily fortified corporate law firm. I took the private elevator directly up to the penthouse suite. Mr. Gallagher was waiting for me in his expansive corner office. Gallagher was a legal predator. He wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and possessed the cold, calculating eyes of a great white shark. He did not bother with pleasantries or useless small talk. He was a man who billed by the minute and thrived on ruthlessly dismantling corporate empires. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and placed Arthur's thick investigative dossier along with the printed county real estate records directly in front of him. Gallagher adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened the file. The room was deathly quiet save for the crisp sound of pages turning as his highly trained eyes devoured the financial records, the forged quitclaim deed, and the explicit documentation of Bradley's $500,000 home equity line of credit. I watched his expression shift from focused neutrality to a dark, predatory amusement. He meticulously reviewed the false Adult Protective Services report and the blank conservatorship documents Jada had tried to force upon me at the restaurant. He closed the folder, steepled his fingers together, and leaned back in his leather executive chair. "Your daughter and her husband have constructed a breathtakingly stupid criminal enterprise," Mr. Hayes Gallagher said, his voice smooth and lethally calm. "Let us break down the exact magnitude of the catastrophic legal nightmare they have just created for themselves. First, we have the forged quitclaim deed. Falsifying a notary public seal and filing a fraudulent property transfer with the county clerk is a severe state-level felony. They have committed perjury, forgery of a legal instrument, and grand theft of real estate. But that is just the appetizer." Gallagher leaned forward, tapping the bank documents with his index finger. The moment Bradley used that fraudulent deed to secure a $500,000 line of credit from an FDIC-insured commercial bank, he elevated this entire situation from a local real estate dispute to massive federal bank fraud. He actively engaged in wire fraud and conspiracy to commit a federal crime. The bank underwriters will be absolutely furious when they realize they issued a massive unsecured loan based on worthless forged paper. Federal prosecutors do not offer leniency when commercial banks are defrauded out of $500,000. And finally, Gallagher continued, picking up the blank medical evaluation form. "We have the attempted conservatorship and the false report to state authorities. That constitutes malicious elder abuse extortion and filing a false report to a government agency. Mr. Hayes, if I make one phone call to my contacts at the FBI White-Collar Crime Division today, federal agents will raid Bradley's office before lunch. They will freeze every single asset connected to his name, seize his company servers, and march him out of that glass building in handcuffs. Jada will be indicted immediately as a primary co-conspirator. They are looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. Give me the green light right now, and I will unleash the absolute full weight of the federal authorities." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tiny cars move far below us on the city streets. I pictured Jada ripping my anniversary check into pieces. I pictured Bradley laughing at me, threatening to throw me into a miserable, underfunded state hospice facility to rot. Calling the FBI today would be swift. It would be highly efficient, but it would also be far too merciful. No, I said, turning my gaze back to Gallagher. Do not call the authorities. Not yet. Gallagher frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Sir, if we wait, they might burn through the bank's money. They might try to liquidate other assets or flee the jurisdiction. If we let them operate, we risk complicating the recovery of the stolen funds. Let them spend the money. I replied, my voice hard and entirely unforgiving. I do not care about the bank's $500,000. The commercial bank has its own high-priced lawyers to handle its financial losses, and my actual property title is safely insulated inside the Apex Blind Trust. If we send them to prison today, they go in as arrogant socialites who simply got caught making a bad business deal. They will spin a narrative to their wealthy friends. They will play the victims of a misunderstanding. I refuse to give them that luxury. I stood up and paced slowly across the plush carpet of the office. Prison provides a bed, 3 meals a day, and a strict routine. It is too sterile. I want them to taste absolute, undeniable ruin first. I want them to experience the agonizing, suffocating terror of bankruptcy. I want their fake high society friends to abandon them and block their phone numbers. I want them to feel the crushing humiliation of losing every single materialistic thing they value before they ever step foot inside a federal courtroom. If we arrest them now, we interrupt their panic. I want to see how far their greed pushes them when they think nobody is watching. Let them dig their hole deeper. Give them enough rope to hang themselves completely. Gallagher smiled slowly, a genuine expression of profound professional respect forming on his face. He understood exactly what kind of war I was waging. It was not just about legal justice, it was about total psychological dismantling. So what is your immediate move? He asked, opening his legal notepad and preparing a fresh pen. I'm going to give them exactly what they want, I replied, sitting back down across from him. I am going to go home and play the role of the defeated, broken old man. I will surrender the main floors of the house to them. I will pack my bags, abandon my master bedroom, and quietly move down into the unfinished basement. Gallagher raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the drastic physical sacrifice. You are going to let them occupy your home. You are going to let them act like they own the place and sleep under your roof. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on his mahogany desk. Yes, because arrogant people are inherently sloppy people. The moment they think they have won, the moment they believe I am permanently suppressed and terrified of their eviction threats, they will drop their guard entirely. They will bring their criminal activities right into my living room. They will flaunt their stolen money. They will discuss their fraudulent company openly. And while they are celebrating their false victory upstairs, my hidden cameras will be recording every single incriminating whisper, every illegal transaction, and every greedy mistake they make in crystal clear high definition. I pointed a finger at the lease agreement for Bradley's office building sitting in the file. Prepare the commercial eviction notice for Bradley's corporate headquarters, Gallagher. Have the process servers ready to deploy the maximum legal pressure on behalf of the Apex Blind Trust. But wait for my signal to execute the strike. I am going back to the basement to set the final trap. I returned to the house and waited. It did not take long for the next phase of their hostile takeover to commence. By late afternoon, Bradley and Jada burst through the front door again, armed with their fraudulent eviction papers and arrogant sneers. I played my part flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump. I stared at the hardwood floor, intentionally adopting the defeated, fragile posture of a broken old man who had completely run out of options. I told them in a quiet, shaking voice that I did not have $3,000 for rent. I told them I would surrender the main floors of the house and quietly move down into the unfinished basement if they would just let me stay under the roof I built. Jada's eyes lit up with a sickening, malicious victory. She did not offer a single ounce of sympathy or hesitation. Instead, she immediately ordered me to clear out of her sight. She marched straight into the master bedroom, the sacred intimate space I had shared with Loretta for 40 years, and started tearing the bed sheets off the mattress. She tossed my clothes into black plastic garbage bags and practically kicked them down the narrow wooden stairs leading to the dark cellar. Bradley stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall and checking his expensive watch as if rushing the removal of his father-in-law was just another minor annoyance in his busy corporate schedule. I dragged my heavy mattress down into the damp, concrete-floored basement. The air smelled of dust, old timber, and forgotten memories. I set up a small, uncomfortable cot in the far corner surrounded by the discarded cardboard boxes of my life. Upstairs, I could hear Jada loudly claiming the master suite as her own, her sharp designer heels clicking victoriously across the floorboards. She had successfully conquered the castle, completely unaware that the damp dungeon she had banished me to was actually the tactical control room. The very next morning, the reckless, unhinged spending spree began. Armed with $500,000 of stolen equity from the fraudulent bank loan, Jada and Bradley acted like lottery winners who had completely lost their grip on reality. Delivery trucks started backing into the driveway on a strict hourly basis. They blindly ordered imported Italian leather sofas, massive flat-screen televisions, and ridiculously overpriced modern art pieces that looked like chaotic paint splatters. But they did not stop at merely replacing my furniture. Jada decided my classic, structurally perfect home was too dated for her supposedly refined high society tastes. She hired a crew of aggressive, overpriced interior decorators to tear down the walls I had built with my own two hands. The deafening roar of heavy sledgehammers and high-speed power saws echoed through the floorboards directly above my head all day long. Dust drifted down through the exposed wooden joists, coating my basement cot in a fine, suffocating white powder. They were literally destroying the house with the money they stole from it. And when the demolition crews finally left for the evening, the real nightmare began. To celebrate their new stolen wealth, they threw loud, obnoxious parties almost every single night. The heavy thumping bass of their music vibrated violently through the basement ceiling, rattling the single exposed light bulb hanging over my head. I sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of clinking champagne glasses and the arrogant, braying laughter of their fake high society friends. They were dancing on my grave. They were toasting to their fraudulent success, fully believing I was cowering in the dark below them, a pathetic and powerless old man who had surrendered his kingdom. But I was not cowering. I was working. The basement was exactly where I needed to be to execute my plan. As a master commercial contractor, I knew the structural blueprints of that house better than I knew the back of my own hand. Every air duct, every electrical conduit, every hidden crawl space was mapped perfectly in my mind. During the early morning hours, while they slept off their expensive hangovers, I moved silently through the structural access panels. I meticulously threaded ultra-miniature surveillance cameras into the brass air vents. I hid microscopic lenses behind the plastic covers of the light switches in the living room, the newly destroyed kitchen, and the garage. I wired the audio receivers directly into the home's main electrical grid, ensuring a constant, uninterrupted power supply that would never require battery changes. Down in the basement, I set up a highly secure encrypted monitoring station behind a towering stack of old moving boxes. I plugged a high-capacity hard drive into a laptop, put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, and turned on the live feed. The crystal-clear high-definition monitors illuminated the dark cellar, and the absolute truth of their miserable existence immediately poured into my ears. The cameras captured absolutely everything. When the party guests finally left and the expensive wine ran out, the polished, wealthy facade instantly crumbled. I recorded vicious alcohol-fueled screaming matches in the kitchen. I watched Bradley pace back and forth across the new rugs, tearing at his hair, cursing about aggressive private lenders who were threatening to break his legs if he did not wire them more cash by the end of the month. I listened to Jada hyperventilate over a declined credit card transaction at a luxury boutique, furiously demanding that Bradley extract more money from the bank account. The $500,000 was already evaporating at a terrifying speed. They were bleeding cash on frivolous luxuries, while the interest on Bradley's massive Ponzi scheme debts compounded daily. They were drowning violently, pulling each other under the water in their panic, and my hard drives were safely storing every single drop of their criminal guilt. I cataloged every confession of fraud, every desperate admission of insolvency, and every cruel insult aimed at me. On the fourth night of my basement exile, the house was unusually quiet. I was sitting at my glowing monitors, reviewing the day's audio files and organizing the evidence for Mr. Gallagher. Suddenly, the motion detection alert on the garage camera feed caught my immediate attention. The screen flickered to life, showing the expansive two-car garage. The space was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, sweeping glow of Bradley's smartphone flashlight. He was not out there looking for misplaced tools. He was slowly, deliberately walking circles around a large, heavy canvas tarp covering a distinct shape in the far corner of the garage. It was my classic 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. I had spent 15 years painstakingly restoring that engine block by hand. It was in pristine show-quality condition, a rare piece of American automotive history worth a small fortune to the right collector. Bradley stopped at the front of the vehicle and aggressively yanked the canvas tarp back, exposing the gleaming, flawless paint job. Through the highly sensitive audio feed, I heard Bradley muttering desperately to himself, calculating the immediate street value of the vintage car. He reached out and stroked the cold metal hood with a hungry, predatory gleam in his pale eyes. The stolen home equity was clearly not enough to appease the violent sharks circling his fake tech company. The desperate cornered rat had just found his next meal, completely unaware that he was stepping right onto a deadly trap. The harsh glare of Bradley's smartphone flashlight bounced off the polished chrome of the 1969 Ford Mustang. From my monitoring station in the basement, I watched him run his trembling hand along the sleek, classic lines of the hood. The silence in the garage was abruptly shattered by the violent vibration of a cell phone. It was not Bradley's primary phone. He reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a cheap prepaid burner phone. His face drained of all color the second he looked at the caller ID. He swiped the screen to answer, pressing the device tightly against his ear. He paced nervously around the concrete floor of the garage. The highly sensitive audio receiver I had wired into the garage door opener picked up every single frantic word. "I told you I just need a few more days," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking with undeniable terror. "The bank funds are tied up in routing holds. I cannot initiate the wire transfer until the commercial hold clears." The voice on the other end of the line was muffled, but the tone was unmistakably lethal. Bradley stopped pacing. He leaned heavily against the workbench, visibly hyperventilating. "Please, you cannot do that," Bradley begged, sweat reflecting off his forehead in the dim light. "I have the money. I just need liquidity. Give me 24 hours. I will have the cash in your hands by tomorrow night. I swear on my life." The call abruptly ended. Bradley let the burner phone slip from his fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. He gripped the edge of the workbench, gasping for air like a man who had just been held underwater. The massive, fraudulent home equity loan was completely gone. Jada had likely blown the last of the available daily limits on her imported furniture and aggressive home renovations. The violent private lenders circling his fake tech company did not care about routing numbers or bank holds. They demanded untraceable cash, and they demanded it immediately. Bradley turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes back toward my Mustang. He was staring at the only rapidly liquid asset left on the property. The very next morning, the high-definition camera I had concealed inside the kitchen smoke detector captured the next phase of his pathetic crime. Bradley waited until Jada left for a brunch date with her high society friends. He practically sprinted into my old home office, which they had carelessly converted into a storage space for their designer luggage. I watched on the primary monitor as he frantically tore through the filing cabinets I had deliberately left unlocked. He tossed decades of organized tax returns and structural blueprints onto the floor until he finally found exactly what he was hunting for. He pulled out the thick blue-bordered envelope containing the official state vehicle title for the Mustang. Bradley carried the title into the kitchen and slammed it onto the pristine marble island. He pulled up a chair, his hands shaking violently as he retrieved a black ballpoint pen from his pocket. From my secondary monitor, I had a perfect top-down, unobstructed view of the countertop. Bradley pulled out his smartphone and opened a digital scan of the fraudulent quitclaim deed they had forced upon the property. He zoomed in tightly on my forged, shaky signature at the bottom of that document. He grabbed a piece of scrap paper and spent 20 agonizing minutes meticulously practicing the curve of my handwriting. He traced the letters over and over, desperate to replicate the exact stroke of a grieving widower. When he felt confident enough in his deceit, he pulled the official state vehicle title toward him. Without a single ounce of hesitation or moral conflict, Bradley forged my signature directly onto the seller line, completely transferring the legal ownership of the classic car. He blew on the ink to dry it, a sickeningly triumphant smile briefly breaking through his absolute panic. He immediately picked up his primary phone and dialed a number. The kitchen microphone captured the entire negotiation. Bradley reached out to a notorious high-volume exotic car broker known for asking zero questions and dealing exclusively in rapid cash transactions. The Mustang was a pristine numbers-matching classic easily valued at over $120,000 at any legitimate auction. Bradley did not have time for auctions. He sounded like a desperate addict begging for a fix. He agreed to sell my priceless vehicle for a pathetic $40,000, demanding the broker arrive at the house with physical cash within the hour. I sat back in my basement chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness for the car. I had rebuilt that engine block to perfection. But a car is simply metal, rubber, and gasoline. A car can be replaced. The undeniable high-definition video evidence of my son-in-law committing a blatant federal felony was absolutely priceless. Less than 2 hours later, a massive diesel flatbed tow truck rumbled up the driveway. I switched my primary monitor to the exterior driveway camera. A heavy-set man wearing a tight leather jacket and a thick gold chain stepped out of the truck cab. Bradley practically ran out of the garage to meet him. The broker walked around the Mustang, whistling in genuine appreciation of the flawless restoration work. He did not bother to inspect the engine or check the undercarriage. He knew a desperate fire sale when he saw one. The broker turned to Bradley and demanded the paperwork. I zoomed the camera lens in as tight as the optical focus would allow. The image on my screen was sharp enough to read the branding on Bradley's polo shirt. Bradley handed over the forged state title. The broker glanced at the signature, completely unbothered by the shaky ink, and shoved the document into his back pocket. He then walked over to the cab of his tow truck, retrieved a thick, bulging manila envelope, and walked back to Bradley. The microphone mounted above the garage door captured the rustle of the thick paper. Bradley tore the envelope open right there in the driveway. He pulled out 4 thick, rubber-banded stacks of crisp $100 bills. He flipped through the stacks frantically, verifying the $40,000 count, while the broker attached heavy steel chains to the undercarriage of my Mustang. "Here are the keys," Bradley said, his voice breathless with relief as he handed them over. The broker nodded, engaged the hydraulic winch, and slowly dragged the classic car onto the flatbed. Within 10 minutes, the tow truck was reversing out of the driveway, carrying away 15 years of my restoration work. Bradley stood alone in the driveway, clutching the massive wad of cash against his chest. He closed his eyes and let out a long, heavy exhale, believing he had just successfully bought his life back from the loan sharks. He shoved the money deep into his pockets and walked back inside the house, completely oblivious to the digital crosshairs resting directly on his forehead. Down in the damp, dark basement, I reached out and clicked the save button on the recording software. The hard drive hummed quietly as it archived the 4K video files and the crystal-clear audio tracks to a secure, encrypted cloud server. I leaned back in my cot and smiled a cold, humorless smile. Bradley thought he was a genius for converting an old man's toy into survival money. He had absolutely no idea how the law actually worked. Forging a legal signature on a state-issued vehicle title is a severe felony. Selling a vehicle with fraudulent ownership documents constitutes grand theft auto. By accepting a massive cash payment for a stolen vehicle, he had just engaged in criminal money laundering. He had solved his 24-hour loan shark problem by eagerly stepping into a trap that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I did not need to protect the car. The car was just bait, and the rat had swallowed it whole. The second undeniable death warrant had been officially signed, sealed, and recorded. The adrenaline from recording Bradley committing grand theft auto had barely settled when the next phase of their criminal enterprise began. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs creaked open, breaking the silence of my damp sanctuary. Heavy, unfamiliar footsteps echoed down the wooden treads, accompanied by the sharp click of Jada's designer heels. I quickly minimized my surveillance software on the laptop screen and pulled a ragged wool blanket over my monitoring station, adopting my carefully crafted posture of a defeated, exhausted old man. Jada descended into the dim light of the cellar, bringing with her a suffocating cloud of expensive perfume and absolute arrogance. Walking right behind her was a man who looked like he belonged anywhere but a medical facility. He wore a rumpled tan suit that hung loosely on his thin frame, and his eyes darted around the basement with the nervous, calculating energy of a petty thief looking for loose valuables. He carried a battered leather medical bag, but his posture lacked any trace of the confident authority that real board-certified physicians carry. He looked exactly like what he was, a corrupt, stripped-down professional, willing to sell his medical license to the highest bidder. Jada stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking around the dusty concrete walls with a look of profound disgust. She pointed a manicured finger toward the far corner where I sat on my uncomfortable cot. "There he is," she said, her voice completely devoid of any daughterly warmth. "He spends all day down here sitting in the dark. He barely recognizes me half the time. It is tragic, really." The shady doctor adjusted his collar and took a step forward, his eyes sweeping over me with zero clinical interest. He was not looking at a patient. He was looking at a transaction. The hidden camera embedded in the smoke detector directly above the stairs had a perfect, unobstructed angle of the entire interaction. Before the doctor could even introduce himself, the heavy footsteps of Bradley echoed down the stairs. He descended rapidly, clutching a thick white envelope in his right hand. The desperate, panicked energy from the driveway the previous day had been replaced by a smug, aggressive confidence. He had cash burning a hole in his pocket, and he was eager to spend it on his final insurance policy against me. Bradley walked straight up to the fake physician, entirely ignoring my presence in the corner of the room. "Do you have the paperwork?" Bradley asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. The doctor nodded, reaching into his battered leather bag. He pulled out a thick stack of official-looking medical documents complete with hospital letterheads and heavy red certification stamps. He handed the packet to Bradley. "It is fully complete and legally binding." The corrupt doctor stated, his tone flat and transactional. "I have officially diagnosed him with advanced late-stage Alzheimer's disease. The clinical notes detail severe cognitive decline, violent mood swings, and a total inability to manage basic personal or financial affairs. With this specific diagnostic code, any family court judge in the state will grant you an immediate emergency conservatorship without requiring an independent psychological review. It is an airtight medical classification." Bradley snatched the documents, his pale eyes scanning the fraudulent medical conclusions with intense, hungry satisfaction. "This is exactly what we need," he muttered. He then extended his right hand, pressing the thick white envelope directly against the doctor's chest. "Here is the agreed-upon compensation. $10,000 in untraceable cash. Consider your services permanently concluded." The hidden camera captured the entire exchange in glorious high definition. I watched from the shadows as the doctor greedily ripped open the flap of the envelope. He quickly thumbed through the crisp $100 bills, likely the very same bills Bradley had just acquired from selling my stolen classic car. The doctor smiled, nodded his head, and shoved the bribe deep into his suit pocket. It was a textbook, undeniable case of medical fraud and criminal bribery. They had just purchased a fake medical sentence to completely strip away my human rights, and they had executed the transaction directly in front of my high-resolution audio and video recording equipment. They were incredibly arrogant, and that arrogance was blinding them to their own impending destruction. But the corrupt doctor was not completely stupid. He knew he needed at least a minimal shred of plausible deniability if he was ever questioned by a medical board or a suspicious judge. "I need to at least engage with the patient for a few minutes," the doctor said, turning his nervous eyes toward me, "just to make sure the physical presentation matches the severe diagnosis on the paperwork." Bradley rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by the delay, but gestured toward my cot. "Knock yourself out," he scoffed. "He is completely useless anyway." The doctor walked slowly across the concrete floor and stopped a few feet from my bed. "Hello, Mr. Hayes," he said in a patronizing, overly loud voice, as if I were deaf as well as senile. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what year it is? This was my moment. If I acted too sharp, the doctor might get spooked and retract the fraudulent paperwork to save his own skin. I needed to hand them the exact illusion they were paying for." I let my shoulders slump forward, physically shrinking my frame. I widened my eyes, filling them with a vacant, terrified confusion. I looked up at the doctor, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. "Loretta," I mumbled, my voice trembling and weak. I looked past the doctor, staring blankly at Jada. "Loretta, why is this strange man in our basement? Did the pipes burst again? Where did you put my heavy wrenches? I need to fix the copper pipes before the winter freeze comes." Jada let out a cruel, mocking laugh. She crossed her arms, looking at her husband with absolute triumph. "See what I mean?" she sneered. "He thinks I am his dead wife. He thinks he is still working construction. His brain is completely gone." Bradley smirked, shaking his head in manufactured pity. "It is genuinely sad to watch," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. The doctor took a step back, completely satisfied with his brief, superficial observation. He had his justification, and more importantly, he had his $10,000. He is exhibiting classic stage 6 symptoms, the doctor confirmed, turning back to Bradley and Jada. Hallucinations, temporal disorientation, and inability to recognize immediate family members. You have everything you need for the judge. The corrupt physician turned around and quickly ascended the wooden stairs, eager to escape the basement and enjoy his newly acquired cash. Bradley and Jada remained in the dark cellar for a few moments longer. Jada looked down at the forged medical documents in Bradley's hands, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated greed. She looked back at me, still keeping up my confused, pathetic act on the cot. "This is it, Bradley," she whispered fiercely, the excitement vibrating in her chest. "The home equity loan is almost gone, but with this medical declaration we have absolute legal control over the entire estate. We do not need to wait for the bank. We do not need to deal with the slow foreclosure process. We hold the keys to the castle." Bradley nodded, a dark, hungry grin spreading across his face. Jada turned on her heels, her designer shoes clicking aggressively against the concrete floor. "Start packing your garbage into trash bags, old man," she commanded, her voice echoing off the cold walls. "We are done playing house. I am calling the aggressive cash buyer investment group right now. They buy properties as is, and they close in 24 hours. We are liquidating this entire house tomorrow morning, and you are going straight into a state-funded psychiatric ward." They marched up the stairs, slamming the heavy door behind them. The very next morning, miles away from the damp basement where they thought they had permanently buried me, Bradley was sitting at the pinnacle of his fabricated empire. My private investigator Arthur had a contact inside the building who provided me with a precise minute-by-minute account of the catastrophic implosion. Bradley was holding a high-stakes meeting in his executive glass boardroom on the top floor of the downtown commercial high-rise. He was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table flanked by 2 of his remaining junior executives and 3 potential new investors he was desperately trying to lure into his collapsing Ponzi scheme. Bradley felt completely invincible. In his mind, he had just successfully bribed a doctor, secured a fraudulent medical diagnosis, and practically guaranteed absolute legal control over my entire life savings. He was wearing a custom-tailored gray suit, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair and swirling a glass of imported sparkling water. He spoke with the unearned, loud confidence of a billionaire tech titan. He threw around meaningless corporate buzzwords about disruptive algorithms, synergistic market scaling, and explosive quarterly projections. He painted a picture of a company poised to dominate the global market, smiling that bright, arrogant smile he used to manipulate everyone around him. The potential investors nodded along, captivated by the expensive view of the city's skyline and the illusion of limitless success Bradley projected so flawlessly. He thought he had successfully outrun his demons. He thought the cash from my stolen Mustang and the impending sale of my house had bought him all the time in the world. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was about to violently open up and swallow him whole. The heavy glass door of the boardroom suddenly swung open, interrupting Bradley mid-sentence. It was not his young, terrified receptionist bringing in more coffee. It was a broad-shouldered man in a plain windbreaker holding a thick, legally bound stack of documents. The man bypassed the reception desk entirely, marching straight into the executive suite with the cold, immovable authority of a court-appointed official. Bradley stopped talking, his arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, attempting to assert his dominance. "Excuse me," Bradley snapped, using his sharpest executive voice. "We are in the middle of a closed-door financial briefing. You need to wait in the lobby." The man did not stop. He walked directly up to the mahogany table and stopped inches away from Bradley. "Are you the chief executive officer of this corporation?" the man asked, his voice booming across the quiet, tense boardroom. Bradley puffed out his chest, glancing nervously at his potential investors. "Yes, I am. I demand you leave my office immediately." The man did not blink. He slammed the thick stack of legal documents directly onto the polished wood table right on top of Bradley's glossy investment brochures. "You have been served," the process server announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room heard him clearly. "This is a formal 3-day notice to pay or quit, accompanied by an emergency commercial eviction mandate and an asset freeze injunction." The air in the boardroom instantly turned to ice. The potential investors shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, exchanging highly alarmed glances. Bradley's face drained of all color, turning a sickly pale white. He looked down at the bold, terrifying black letters printed on the top page of the legal packet. The process server continued, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are currently in severe violation of your commercial lease agreement. You are $80,000 in arrears for back rent and penalty fees. You have exactly 72 hours to remit the full $80,000 balance in certified funds. If you fail to comply by the deadline, local law enforcement will forcibly lock down this suite, and all corporate assets, servers, and equipment within these walls will be permanently seized to satisfy the debt. The process server turned around and walked out of the room, leaving a devastating, suffocating silence in his wake. Bradley stood frozen, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the legal documents. His junior executives looked at him in sheer terror. The potential investors did not ask any questions. They simply stood up, grabbed their briefcases, and walked out of the boardroom without a single word. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one. Bradley did not even try to stop them. He reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the eviction notice. His eyes scanned the bottom of the page, looking for the name of the aggressive commercial landlord who had just publicly executed him. There, printed clearly under the signature line for the property management firm, was the legal entity demanding his immediate destruction, the Apex Blind Trust. Bradley stared at the name, completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible corporate landlord currently crushing his throat was the very same old man he had banished to a basement. The boardroom emptied completely, leaving Bradley entirely alone in his glass cage. The meticulously crafted facade of the brilliant tech CEO shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He collapsed back into his ergonomic chair, grasping his hair and pulling hard. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of his reality finally caved in on him. The loan sharks were demanding cash to spare his physical safety, but losing the physical office space meant the absolute death of his company. If he was evicted, the remaining investors would panic, the Securities and Exchange Commission would be notified of the default, and the federal investigations would begin within days. He had exactly 3 days to produce $80,000 he did not have. He grabbed his cell phone from the table, his fingers slipping on the glass screen due to his cold sweat. He dialed Jada's number. He did not wait for her to say hello. "Jada, we need cash right now," he screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "The management company just served me with an eviction notice in front of investors. They are going to seize the entire office on Friday. They want $80,000 immediately, or we are completely finished." Jada's voice came through the speaker, equally frantic. "What are you talking about, Bradley? We just paid the doctor. We do not have $80,000 in liquid cash until the house sells." Bradley slammed his fist onto the table, tears of sheer terror welling in his eyes. "Then you sell that house tomorrow," he roared. "I do not care if you have to take a massive loss. I do not care if you have to accept half of what it is worth. You call those aggressive cash buyers back right now. Tell them we will accept an immediate cash offer if they wire the funds to our account in 24 hours. Do not wait for the conservatorship hearing. Just use the quitclaim deed and get rid of the property tomorrow morning. Our entire lives depend on it." Back at my house, I sat quietly in the dark basement, listening to the frantic, muffled footsteps echoing through the ceiling above me. Jada was running back and forth across the hardwood floors, yelling into her cell phone, desperately trying to schedule the immediate liquidation of my home. Her panic was a symphony of poetic justice to my ears. She was moving with reckless blind speed, completely unaware that she was rushing headfirst into a reinforced brick wall. The next morning arrived with a heavy overcast sky. I remained seated on my cot, wearing a simple cardigan, playing the role of the docile, oblivious victim to absolute perfection. Exactly at 10 o'clock, the sharp, aggressive chime of the front doorbell rang through the house. I watched my primary surveillance monitor as Jada practically sprinted to the front door, her face a mask of desperate anticipation. She pulled the heavy wooden door open. Standing on my front porch were 3 men wearing slick suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. They were the aggressive real estate investors, the predatory cash buyers who specialized in scooping up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar and closing transactions in a matter of hours. Jada greeted them with a wide, manic smile, ushering them inside my home as if it were a clearance sale at a discount store. The final act of their tragic play had officially begun, and I was holding the only script that mattered. The 3 men stepped into my foyer with the aggressive, entitled swagger of vultures circling a wounded animal. They wore cheap off-of-the-rack suits and carried thick leather clipboards, their eyes darting around my home with cold, calculating precision. These were not families looking for a place to raise their children. These were predatory cash buyers, men who made their fortunes by smelling desperation and squeezing every last dime out of people facing immediate financial ruin. Jada walked right beside them, her hands fluttering nervously as she guided them through the archways I had built with my own 2 hands. I sat quietly in a simple wooden armchair in the far corner of the living room wearing a faded cardigan. I kept my head slightly bowed, playing the role of the invisible, senile old man they so desperately needed me to be. The lead investor, a short balding man with a wireless earpiece permanently wedged in his ear, tapped his pen against his clipboard. He looked up at the custom crown molding I had painstakingly installed 30 years ago. "This entire aesthetics is completely dated," he declared loudly, making sure Jada heard his manufactured disappointment. "We are going to have to gut this entire first floor. The hardwood is salvageable, but the kitchen needs a complete demolition. It is going to cost us a fortune to modernize this property for a quick flip." Jada nodded eagerly, her desperation bleeding through her polished socialite facade. "I completely understand, gentlemen," she said, her voice tight with panic. "We are highly motivated sellers. My husband and I are relocating our primary assets, and we are willing to accept a significant price reduction in exchange for an immediate 24-hour cash closing." The investors exchanged a brief, knowing look. They had her exactly where they wanted her. They casually offered her a figure that was barely 40% of the actual market value of the home. It was an insulting, predatory lowball offer. A smart seller would have thrown them out immediately. But Jada did not hesitate for a single second. She practically gasped in relief, blindly agreeing to the horrific terms simply because it meant fast, untraceable cash to save Bradley from his impending commercial eviction. With the verbal agreement established, Jada finally turned her attention back to me. Her fake professional smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated revulsion. She marched into the kitchen, violently yanked open the utility drawer, and pulled out a heavy-duty black plastic garbage bag. She walked briskly across the living room and threw the plastic bag directly into my lap. It hit my chest with a dull, disrespectful thud. "Time is up, old man," she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the investors across the room would not hear the full extent of her cruelty. "Start packing your garbage. You are leaving this house today." I looked up at her, maintaining my vacant, confused expression. "Leaving?" I asked intentionally, letting my voice waver. "Where am I going, Jada? This is my house." She let out a sharp, mocking sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically. "This has not been your house since the day you signed it over to me," she hissed. "And you are no longer my problem. I finalized the paperwork with the doctor yesterday. The state approved the emergency medical directive this morning. A transport van from the county psychiatric facility is arriving in exactly 2 hours to collect you. You are going to a secure state-run nursing home for the severely cognitively impaired. You will have a bed, 3 square meals of slop, and a locked door so you cannot wander off and embarrass me anymore." I stared at the black plastic garbage bag resting on my knees, a heavy-duty trash bag. That was the physical container my only daughter deemed appropriate for an entire lifetime of my personal belongings. 40 years of hard work, 40 years of providing for her every need, 40 years of unconditionally loving her, and she was literally treating me like disposable waste. The investors wandered back into the living room, glancing curiously at our interaction. "Pay no attention to him, gentlemen," Jada announced, instantly switching back to her sweet, artificially polite voice. "He is my father. He suffers from severe advanced dementia. We are moving him into a specialized medical care facility this afternoon. It is tragic, but it is for his own safety. He does not really understand what is happening around him anymore." The investors nodded in fake sympathy, completely unbothered by the human tragedy unfolding right in front of them, so long as the real estate deal remained intact. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the garbage bag back in her face. I did not stand up and expose her massive, fraudulent conspiracy to the men holding the clipboards. I knew that if I fought back right now, if I demonstrated my absolute mental clarity, it would ruin the entire trap. The cash buyers would get spooked and walk away. Jada and Bradley would realize I was onto them and attempt to flee the jurisdiction before the federal authorities could secure their indictments. I needed her to sign that contract. I needed her to formally commit the crime on paper. So I swallowed my pride, gripping the slick black plastic of the trash bag. I slowly stood up, letting my hands shake with manufactured weakness. I shuffled quietly toward the hallway closet, keeping my head down, the perfect picture of a defeated, broken senior citizen. I opened the closet door and began pulling my old, faded flannel shirts off their hangers. I dropped them unceremoniously into the garbage bag one by one. I added a pair of worn-out work boots and a few pairs of denim trousers. I packed my life into a sack while my daughter finalized the destruction of her own. Back in the living room, the lead investor placed a thick, legally binding preliminary sales contract onto the coffee table. He handed Jada a silver pen. "Just sign on the dotted line, ma'am," he said smoothly. "This secures the purchase price and locks in the 24-hour closing window." Jada did not even bother to read the terms. She snatched the pen and signed her name with a dramatic, arrogant flourish. She pressed the pen down so hard I could hear it scratching against the paper from the hallway. A massive, victorious smile stretched across her face. She truly believed she had just won the war. She believed she had successfully discarded her father, secured the cash to save her husband's fraudulent company, and permanently secured her fake high society lifestyle. The lead investor picked up the signed contract, reviewed the signature, and nodded in satisfaction. He slipped the document into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. "Excellent doing business with you," he said, shaking Jada's hand. "I am taking this contract directly to our partnered title company right now. They are going to run a priority expedited title search this afternoon to ensure the deed is completely clear of any hidden liens or encumbrances. Once the title search comes back clean tomorrow morning, we will wire the funds directly into your designated bank account and the property will officially be ours. We will see you tomorrow for the final handover." Jada escorted the three men out the front door, thanking them profusely. The moment the door clicked shut, she let out a loud, triumphant shriek. She immediately pulled out her cell phone and dialed Bradley's number. "Bradley," she yelled into the receiver, pacing excitedly across the living room. "I did it. I signed the preliminary contract. The cash buyers are running the title search right now. We will have the money wired to us tomorrow morning. You can pay off the commercial eviction notice and the private lenders by tomorrow afternoon. We are saved." I stood quietly in the hallway shadows, clutching my black garbage bag. I listened to her celebrate her imaginary victory. She was absolutely ecstatic. But I was the only person in the house who knew the terrifying reality of what was about to happen. The investors were taking that fraudulent contract to a professional licensed title company, a title company whose sole purpose was to dig deep into the county archives and verify the true legal ownership of a property. They were not going to find Jada's name. They were not going to find Bradley's name. They were going to dig past the fake quitclaim deed and run straight into the impenetrable, ironclad legal wall of the Apex Blind Trust. The countdown had officially begun. The bomb was armed, the timer was ticking, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop the explosive shockwave from destroying their lives. While Jada was busy packing my entire existence into a cheap plastic garbage bag, the lead investor from the cash buyer group was pulling his luxury sedan into the parking lot of a highly respected downtown title and escrow agency. He strutted into the polished, glass-walled office, completely confident in his predatory acquisition. He walked straight up to the reception desk and handed the signed preliminary sales contract to a senior escrow officer named Sarah. She was a meticulous veteran in the real estate business, a woman whose entire career was dedicated to finding hidden flaws, unpaid tax liens, and discrepancies in property transfers. She took the document, adjusted her reading glasses, and began typing the property address into the county's centralized digital registry to run the mandatory title search. At first, the process seemed completely routine. The system processed the query, accessing decades of municipal property records and tax assessments. Then the computer screen flashed. A bright, glaring red warning banner populated across the monitor. It was a severe chain of title discrepancy. Sarah stopped typing immediately. She leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowing in deep professional confusion. The digital system indicated a catastrophic break in the legal ownership lineage. The investor, noticing her sudden change in demeanor, tapped his fingers impatiently on the glass desk. He asked if there was a problem with the closing timeline, clearly annoyed by the delay. Sarah did not answer him right away. She aggressively clicked through the digital archives, pulling up the original warranty deeds and the most recent filings. She pulled up the quitclaim deed that Jada and Bradley had fraudulently recorded just weeks earlier. Then she pulled up the historical transfer records from 15 years ago. The red warning flags multiplied rapidly on her screen, signaling a massive, undeniable legal contradiction. The property could not be sold today, tomorrow, or ever. The contract Jada had just signed with such triumphant arrogance was fundamentally invalid. Sarah slowly turned her computer monitor around so the aggressive cash buyer could see the glaring red alerts for himself. "We have a massive legal problem," she stated, her voice tight with professional alarm. "The woman who just signed your purchase agreement, Jada Hayes, does not own this property. Her husband Bradley does not own this property. The investor scoffed, pointing a thick finger at the printed contract resting on her desk. He argued that he had seen the county records himself. He insisted there was a recorded quitclaim deed transferring the property from Milton Hayes directly to them, properly signed and notarized. Sarah shook her head, pulling up the historical deed from 15 years ago. The quitclaim deed they filed is absolutely worthless, she explained, tracing the digital timeline with her pen. A quitclaim deed only transfers the specific legal interest that the signer currently holds at the exact moment of signing. If the signer owns nothing, the deed transfers nothing. 15 years ago, Milton Hayes legally transferred the total and absolute ownership of this entire estate into a highly secure private corporate entity known as the Apex Blind Trust. He legally removed his own name from the individual property title a decade and a half ago. Therefore, when he supposedly signed this new transfer document for his daughter last month, he possessed zero individual ownership rights to give away. You cannot give away a house you do not personally own. The investor stared at the screen, the color rapidly draining from his face. He realized he had just wasted his morning negotiating a phantom deal, but it was far worse than a simple real estate misunderstanding. Sarah pulled up the notary public stamp on the fraudulent deed and cross-referenced it with the state database. The notary commission number attached to this document is completely fabricated. She revealed, her voice dropping to a shocked whisper. This is not a clerical error. This is a deliberate, highly sophisticated real estate forgery. Jada and Bradley actively manufactured a fake legal document to steal a property from a corporate trust. The investor snatched his preliminary contract off the desk as if it were on fire. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal crime. He stormed out of the title office, furiously dialing his legal team to completely sever all ties with Jada and cancel the entire transaction. But the catastrophic chain reaction did not stop at a canceled real estate deal. The title company's urgent inquiry into the fraudulent deed triggered an automated alert system connected to the National Banking Registry. Hundreds of miles away in the corporate compliance division of the massive out-of-state commercial bank that had foolishly issued Bradley his $500,000 home equity line of credit, internal alarms began to blare. A senior risk analyst received the urgent digital notification and immediately pulled up Bradley's loan file. The bank had expedited the massive loan based on the careless assumption that the recently filed quitclaim deed was legitimate. Now the digital clearinghouse was explicitly telling them that their $500,000 collateral was entirely fictitious. The analyst initiated an emergency manual review. Within 10 minutes, the terrifying reality set in. The bank had essentially handed $500,000 of federally insured funds to a man who had offered a forged piece of paper as security. The collateral did not exist. The loan was entirely unsecured and built on a foundation of blatant criminal deception. The compliance officer did not hesitate. He immediately slammed his hand down on the proverbial panic button. He initiated a total immediate freeze on all financial accounts connected to Bradley and Jada. Every single credit card, every checking account, every remaining dollar from the stolen loan was instantly locked and rendered inaccessible. But more importantly, because the transaction crossed state lines and involved an FDIC-insured institution, the bank bypassed local police entirely. The compliance director picked up his secure phone and dialed the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, officially reporting a massive instance of federal bank fraud. While the federal gears of justice violently locked into place, the immediate fallout struck much closer to home. Across town, sitting in a plush leather chair in his expensive boutique law firm, Jada and Bradley's personal defense attorney was reviewing his afternoon schedule. He was the man they kept on retainer to handle their messy business disputes, completely unaware of the massive criminal conspiracy they had been running behind his back. His desk phone rang with a sharp, piercing trill. It was not a client. It was an urgent, direct call from a contact at the United States Attorney's Office. The lawyer listened to the voice on the other end of the line for exactly 30 seconds. All the blood rushed out of his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. The federal prosecutor informed him that a grand jury subpoena was currently being drafted for his clients regarding massive federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and real estate forgery. The prosecutor explicitly laid out the evidence concerning the Apex Blind Trust and the completely fabricated quitclaim deed. The lawyer dropped the phone receiver. It clattered loudly against the mahogany desk. He knew exactly what this meant. His clients had not just crossed a legal line. They had sprinted blindfolded over a federal cliff, and they were actively dragging his firm's reputation down with them. Panic consumed him entirely. He did not bother grabbing his briefcase. He did not say a single word to his terrified secretary. He sprinted out of his office, his heart hammering against his ribs in absolute terror. He practically ripped the car keys from his pocket, bolted into the parking garage, and threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury sedan. He slammed his foot on the accelerator tires, screeching against the concrete as he sped frantically toward my house, desperate to stop Jada before she buried them all permanently in a federal penitentiary. While the defense attorney was desperately breaking every speed limit in the city to reach my property, I sat in the cool dampness of the basement, my eyes locked on the primary surveillance monitor. The live feed from the living room displayed a scene of absolute sickening arrogance. Bradley had just arrived home from his disastrous morning at the commercial office. His tailored suit jacket was discarded on the armchair. His tie loosened, but the sheer panic that had gripped him in the boardroom was completely gone. Jada's news about the cash buyers had acted like a miraculous adrenaline injection. He genuinely believed they had narrowly escaped total ruin. He believed the phantom cash from the fraudulent house sale would hit their accounts the next morning, allowing him to pay off the commercial eviction, silence the violent loan sharks, and permanently secure their wealthy facade. Jada walked out of the newly demolished kitchen carrying a bottle of imported champagne and 2 crystal flutes. She popped the cork with a loud celebratory bang that echoed through the high-definition audio feed. She poured the bubbling liquid and handed a glass to Bradley. They clinked their glasses together, a sharp chime of premature victory. To us, Bradley declared, a smug, greedy grin stretching across his face, to surviving the storm and shedding the dead weight. Jada laughed a high-pitched, cruel sound. She took a long sip of her champagne and looked down at the hardwood floor right above where she assumed I was cowering. "I told you I would handle the old man," she sneered, her voice dripping with venomous pride. By tomorrow afternoon, the state transport van will haul him off to the psychiatric ward. We will have the wire transfer from the investors, and we can finally move on with our lives without his pathetic, embarrassing presence dragging us down. He really thought he could dictate terms to us. He really thought he had power. Bradley chuckled, leaning back against the expensive Italian leather sofa they had purchased with my stolen equity. "He is probably sitting in the dark right now, crying into his dirty flannel shirts," Bradley mocked. He brought this entirely on himself. If he had just signed the conservatorship gracefully, we would not have had to resort to the heavy-handed tactics. But some people just need to be put in their place. They took another deep drink of their champagne, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. They were counting their millions before the bank vault had even been opened. They were so utterly consumed by their own perceived brilliance that they did not hear the screech of rubber tires aggressively dragging across the concrete driveway outside. The heavy oak front door did not just open. It was violently thrown inward, crashing against the drywall with a thunderous impact that made Jada scream and drop her crystal flute. The glass shattered into a dozen pieces across the hardwood. Their high-priced defense attorney stumbled into the foyer. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. His usually immaculate hair was a disheveled mess, and his eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked absolutely nothing like the polished legal professional they paid an exorbitant retainer fee to keep. Jada placed a hand over her chest, trying to recover her composure. "What on earth is wrong with you?" she snapped, thoroughly offended by the violent intrusion into her celebration. "You cannot just barge into our home like a maniac. We are in the middle of a private celebration." The lawyer did not apologize. He marched directly into the center of the living room, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and profound fear. "What have you done?" he roared, his voice cracking with intensity. "What the absolute hell have you two done?" Bradley stepped forward, adopting his authoritative CEO posture. "Lower your voice immediately," Bradley commanded. "We just secured a cash buyer for this property. The financial liquidity crisis is completely resolved. We are closing the sale tomorrow morning, so whatever minor legal issue you are having a meltdown over can be handled then." The lawyer let out a frantic, humorless laugh that bordered on hysteria. "You are not closing on anything tomorrow," he shouted, waving his hands frantically in the air. "You do not own this property. You never owned this property. You mortgaged a house that does not belong to your father personally," Jada scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "That is ridiculous. We filed the quitclaim deed weeks ago. The county clerk recorded it. My father signed the paperwork with his own hand. We are the sole legal owners on the public registry." The lawyer stepped so close to Jada that she was forced to take a step back. A quitclaim deed is a worthless piece of paper if the signer holds zero legal interest in the asset. He spat the words flying from his mouth like venom. Your father did not own this real estate. He legally transferred the entire estate into an impenetrable corporate entity called the Apex Blind Trust 15 years ago. You did not steal a house from a senile old man. You forged a notary stamp and attempted to steal a multi-million-dollar asset from a highly aggressive corporate trust. Bradley's authoritative posture instantly evaporated. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The glass of champagne slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor and soaking into the expensive rug. What are you talking about? Bradley stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The bank underwriters approved the home equity loan. They gave us $500,000. They verified the deed. They verified a fraudulent document because you rushed the process. The lawyer yelled, pacing frantically across the room. But the title company you tried to use today dug deeper. They flagged the discrepancy and alerted the National Banking Registry. Do you have any idea what you have triggered? That commercial bank realized they issued $500,000 in federally insured funds based on a forged document. That is not a civil dispute. That is a massive, undeniable case of federal bank fraud. You committed wire fraud, forgery, and grand theft across state lines. The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The celebratory atmosphere was instantly replaced by the crushing, undeniable weight of a federal indictment. Jada's hands began to shake violently. She looked at Bradley, waiting for him to offer a brilliant corporate solution, a smooth-talking strategy to get them out of the nightmare. But Bradley was completely paralyzed. The United States Attorney's Office just called my personal cell phone, the lawyer continued, his voice shaking with professional dread. They are currently drafting grand jury subpoenas. The FBI is actively preparing warrants. You dragged my law firm into a federal criminal conspiracy, and I am formally recusing myself from your representation effective immediately. I will not lose my license because you two decided to play real estate mafia. Bradley aggressively reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands were trembling so severely he could barely unlock the screen. He tapped the banking application, desperately trying to check the remaining balance of the stolen home equity funds. He needed to wire the money out, to hide it, to salvage anything he could. The app loaded for a fraction of a second before a stark, glaring red notification locked the entire screen. Account suspended. Action required by federal mandate. Bradley stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. He quickly opened his secondary business account. The same red warning flashed back at him. Jada frantically dug into her designer purse and pulled out her own phone. She opened her premium credit card applications. Every single one of them displayed the exact same catastrophic message. Emergency freeze initiated. They froze everything, Bradley whispered, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing horror. The checking accounts, the savings, the credit lines, the entire $500,000 is completely locked. Jada dropped her phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. We have nothing. She gasped, tears of pure terror welling in her eyes. The cash buyers are gone. The bank money is gone. The private lenders are going to kill us, Bradley. They are going to kill us before the FBI even gets the chance to arrest us. The lawyer grabbed his briefcase, eager to escape the sinking ship. I highly suggest you find a federal public defender by tomorrow morning, he said coldly, walking toward the front door. Because the Department of Justice does not negotiate with forgers. Before the lawyer could grab the door handle, he stopped and turned back around, his brow furrowed in deep, urgent confusion. The federal prosecutor specifically mentioned the entity that owns this property, the lawyer said. He said the Apex Blind Trust is pursuing maximum aggressive litigation against you for the forgery. Who exactly controls that trust? Who is the primary executor actively pressing these federal charges? Bradley and Jada froze. The question hung heavily in the tense air. They slowly turned their heads, looking at each other as the horrifying, devastating realization finally clicked into place. The Apex Blind Trust. The exact same corporate entity that had served Bradley with a commercial eviction notice just a few hours earlier. The exact same trust that owned his office building and now apparently owned the very house they were standing in. There was only one person capable of orchestrating an invisible corporate empire from within the walls of this property. There was only one person who knew exactly how much money they had stolen, exactly which doctors they had bribed, and exactly how to dismantle their lives with surgical, terrifying precision. Jada's eyes slowly drifted away from the lawyer and locked onto the solid wooden door in the hallway. the door that led directly down into the dark, damp cellar. "He is not crazy," Jada whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid breathing. "He never had dementia. He knew absolutely everything." Bradley's jaw dropped. The arrogant tech CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a man who realized he had just walked blindly into an elaborate, perfectly executed execution chamber. They did not say another word to the fleeing lawyer. They did not look at the shattered champagne glasses on the floor. Driven by a volatile mixture of sheer terror and desperate fury, Jada and Bradley abandoned the living room and rushed toward the hallway. They threw open the basement door and charged down the narrow wooden staircase, fully intending to confront the helpless old man they thought they had buried in the dark. I sat quietly in my leather armchair at the bottom of the stairs, wearing a perfectly tailored Italian suit, waiting for them to arrive. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs was violently kicked open. The hinges groaned in protest as the door slammed against the drywall. Jada and Bradley charged down the narrow, creaking staircase. Their faces were twisted into masks of desperate and unhinged panic. They descended into the cellar, fully expecting to find a confused and broken old man cowering on a dirty cot. They wanted a helpless victim they could easily intimidate and interrogate about the sudden collapse of their fraudulent empire. Instead, they hit the concrete floor of the basement and froze completely in their tracks. The breath was instantly sucked out of their lungs. The dark and damp dungeon they thought they had banished me to was gone. The dim, exposed light bulb had been turned off, replaced by the warm and sophisticated glow of several high-end studio lamps I had positioned perfectly around my monitoring station. But it was not the lighting that left them utterly paralyzed. It was me. I was no longer wearing the faded flannel shirts and the worn-out denim trousers I had meticulously packed into that black plastic garbage bag just hours earlier. I was sitting comfortably in a luxurious tufted leather armchair I had quietly moved downstairs. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored Italian charcoal suit, a crisp white dress shirt, and a silk tie. My posture was perfectly straight, radiating the cold and immovable authority of a man who had built a massive corporate empire from the ground up. I looked exactly like the apex predator I truly was. Standing directly to my right, leaning casually against a stack of storage boxes with his arms crossed, was Mr. Gallagher. He wore his signature razor-sharp suit and a predatory, amused smile. He looked at my daughter and her husband the way a butcher looks at a particularly pathetic piece of meat. Jada's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish gasping for air on dry land. She stared at my immaculate suit, her eyes darting frantically between me and the ruthless corporate litigator standing by my side. Bradley physically stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the concrete. The aggressive and entitled tech CEO, who had threatened to throw me into a state-funded psychiatric ward just days ago, was completely gone. He was trembling violently. His pale eyes were wide with an absolute primal terror as the horrifying reality of his situation finally began to set in. "Welcome to the basement," I said, my voice echoing with a deep, resonant calm that commanded absolute silence. "I hope you do not mind the new decor. I found it necessary to upgrade my office while you were busy destroying the rest of my property." Jada shook her head, unable to process the total transformation standing right in front of her. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What is going on here? Who is this man? Why are you dressed like that?" I did not answer her immediately. I reached over to the small table next to my armchair and picked up a thick, legally bound document. I tossed it effortlessly across the room. The heavy packet landed right at Bradley's feet with a sharp, authoritative slap against the concrete. "Pick it up, Bradley," I commanded. My tone left zero room for hesitation or negotiation. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He slowly bent down, his hands shaking so severely he could barely grip the paper. He pulled the document up to his chest. "You want to know who the Apex Blind Trust is?" I asked, leaning forward slightly in my leather chair. "You want to know the identity of the invisible corporate landlord who just served you with a commercial eviction notice and froze your entire fraudulent tech company? Open to the last page, Bradley. Look at the primary executor's signature." Bradley's eyes darted down to the bottom of the final page. He stared at the bold black ink. His breathing became incredibly shallow. His chest heaved as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. He read the name over and over again, his brain violently rejecting the catastrophic truth printed right in front of him. Milton Hayes. My name was signed on the executive line authorizing the absolute destruction of his commercial lease. Bradley let the document slip from his fingers. It fluttered to the floor like a dead leaf. His knees visibly buckled. He collapsed backward, hitting the bottom step of the wooden staircase with a heavy, defeated thud. He buried his face in his trembling hands. "You," Bradley gasped, his voice completely hollowed out by sheer terror. "You own the high-rise. You are the Apex Trust." I nodded slowly, allowing the devastating reality to fully crush his spirit. "I own the high-rise, Bradley. I own the corporate office you used to defraud your gullible investors. I own the ground beneath your expensive desk. And as your lawyer so kindly informed you upstairs, I legally own this entire residential estate. I have owned it for 15 years. You did not steal a house from a senile old man. You forged a legal document and committed federal bank fraud against a multi-million-dollar corporate entity that I entirely control. You played a very stupid game against a man who wrote the rule book." Jada looked at her husband, watching him crumble into a pathetic, whimpering mess on the stairs. She turned her furious, terrified eyes back to me. "You set us up," she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You tricked us into signing that contract today. You let us take out that bank loan. You knew it was a crime. You deliberately let us destroy ourselves. I did not force you to do anything, Jada." I replied, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "I simply provided you with the rope and you eagerly tied the noose around your own necks. I gave you every opportunity to be decent human beings. I gave you my love, my support, and my home. But your greed was a bottomless pit. You wanted everything I had and you were willing to throw me into a locked psychiatric ward to get it. But if you think the forged real estate deed is the only piece of evidence I have, you are vastly underestimating my preparation." I picked up a small black remote control resting on the arm of my chair. I pointed it toward the far wall of the basement. I had spent the previous night mounting a massive 70-inch flat-screen television directly onto the concrete. It was one of the exact same televisions Jada had recklessly purchased using my stolen home equity funds. I pressed the power button. The massive screen flickered to life, illuminating the dark cellar with a bright, glaring light. I pressed play. The high-definition video began to roll, accompanied by crystal-clear audio. Jada and Bradley stared at the screen in absolute horror. The first clip showed the dark garage. It showed Bradley frantically tracing my signature from his phone onto the state vehicle title. It showed him handing the forged title to the shady, exotic car broker and greedily stuffing $40,000 of untraceable cash into his pockets. Bradley let out a pathetic, strangled sob as he watched himself commit grand theft auto in vivid, undeniable detail. I hit the next button. The screen instantly transitioned to the basement stairs. It showed Jada walking down with the rumpled, corrupt doctor trailing right behind her. It showed Bradley rushing down the steps and pressing a thick white envelope containing $10,000 directly into the doctor's chest. The audio captured every single damning word of their transaction perfectly. "I have officially diagnosed him with advanced late-stage Alzheimer's disease," the doctor's voice echoed loudly through the basement. "Here is the agreed-upon compensation," Bradley's voice responded on the recording. $10,000 in untraceable cash. The video clearly showed Bradley and Jada mocking me, celebrating their fraudulent medical diagnosis, and ruthlessly commanding me to pack my life into a trash bag. The footage was entirely irrefutable. It was a flawless, airtight documentation of medical fraud, criminal bribery, and elder abuse. Jada covered her mouth with her trembling hands, tears of pure panic streaming down her face. She realized the absolute magnitude of my surveillance. She realized I had watched them. I had listened to them. I had meticulously documented every single malicious, greedy action they had taken since the very moment they kicked me out of the master bedroom. "You recorded us," Jada whispered, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You recorded everything we did in this house, everything I confirmed coldly, every stolen dollar, every illegal transaction, every cruel insult, Mr. Gallagher has already secured duplicate copies of all these files on an encrypted federal server. There is no deleting it. There is no escaping it. You have effectively documented your own federal indictments." Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, rocking back and forth on the bottom stair. He was completely broken. The arrogant tech CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal facing decades behind bars. "We will give the money back," Bradley begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "We will cancel the house sale. We will pay the bank back. Please, Milton, please do not turn this over to the authorities. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just let us walk away from this." I stared at the pathetic, groveling man sitting on my stairs. "You crossed the line of no return the moment you tried to strip me of my human rights, Bradley," I stated with absolute finality. "You do not get to walk away from the destruction you caused just because you finally realized you are the one trapped inside the burning building. The consequences for your actions are no longer in my hands." The heavy, oppressive silence of the basement was suddenly shattered. A sound pierced through the quiet suburban neighborhood, starting as a distant wail and rapidly escalating into a deafening, aggressive shriek. It was the sharp, unmistakable blare of a police siren. Jada and Bradley froze, their eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic. The siren did not pass by the house. It grew louder and more aggressive, pulling directly into the driveway. And it was not just one siren. The distinct overlapping wails of a second, and then a third patrol car joined the chaotic chorus. The flashing red and blue strobe lights violently pierced through the small ground-level basement windows, painting the concrete walls in a chaotic, terrifying strobe effect. The heavy, authoritative slamming of car doors echoed from the front lawn. Jada let out a raw, hysterical scream, backing away from the stairs, as if the wooden steps had suddenly caught fire. The authorities were not here to haul a senile old man to a state-funded psychiatric ward. They were here for the predators. Heavy-booted footsteps thundered across the hardwood floors directly above us. The loud, authoritative shouts of law enforcement officers echoed through the main level of the house, commanding anyone inside to show their hands. The chaotic noise cascaded down the narrow basement staircase. Jada scrambled backward, pressing her spine flat against the concrete wall, her chest heaving in absolute panic. Bradley remained frozen on the bottom step, his eyes darting frantically as the beams of high-powered tactical flashlights pierced the gloom of the cellar. 3 uniformed police officers descended the stairs with their hands resting cautiously on their duty weapons. They swept the room with a practiced, intimidating efficiency. Their eyes completely bypassed me, sitting calmly in my leather chair. They bypassed Mr. Gallagher, leaning casually against the storage boxes. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw, locked his gaze entirely on my son-in-law. Bradley, the officer, barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with unquestionable authority. "Step away from the stairs and place your hands flat on the top of your head." Bradley raised his trembling hands, his face a mask of pure terror. "Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. "If this is about the bank loan, my attorney is handling the commercial dispute right now. I have the money to pay them back." The lead officer did not flinch. He holstered his flashlight and unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. "We are not here for any bank loan," the officer stated coldly, grabbing Bradley by the shoulder and spinning him aggressively around to face the rough concrete wall. "You are under arrest for grand theft, auto criminal possession of stolen property, and felony forgery of a state document." Bradley gasped, his cheek pressed hard against the cold wall. "The car," he whimpered, absolute shock washing over him. "The exotic car broker you conducted business with yesterday morning is not a fool," the officer explained, yanking Bradley's arms behind his back and snapping the steel cuffs securely around his wrists. The broker noticed the erratic signature on the vehicle title and ran a deep background check on the registration. When he discovered the classic Mustang was registered to a corporate trust and not to you personally, he immediately contacted the police to avoid catching a federal fencing charge himself. He handed over the forged title, the security footage from his tow truck, and his official statement. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The officer finished reciting the Miranda rights with a monotonous, practiced rhythm. Bradley slumped forward, his knees buckling, but the 2 officers held him up by his armpits. They forcefully marched him toward the wooden stairs. "Move your feet," they commanded, half walking and half dragging the ruined tech executive up from the basement. I stood up from my leather chair, adjusted the cuffs of my tailored Italian suit, and followed them upstairs at a measured, dignified pace. Mr. Gallagher walked right beside me, a quiet observer to the masterful execution of our legal trap. We emerged from the basement and walked through the living room, stepping right over the shattered crystal champagne glasses lying on the floor. The officers pushed the front door wide open, marching Bradley out onto the front porch. The cool evening air hit my face. The entire neighborhood was completely bathed in the chaotic, flashing red and blue strobe lights of 3 parked police cruisers. This was an upscale, quiet suburban street where people prided themselves on their pristine public image. The commotion had drawn everyone out of their houses. I stood on the top step of my porch and looked out at the manicured lawns. A crowd of over 30 neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property line. These were the exact same wealthy, judgmental people who had eagerly attended Jada's lavish house parties. These were the very people who had snickered at my faded flannel shirts, whispering behind my back that I was just a senile, poor old man dragging down the property value. Now they were standing on the sidewalks with their smartphones raised high in the air, actively recording every single second of Bradley's catastrophic downfall. The arrogant, untouchable white corporate CEO was being frog-marched across the grass in a rumpled suit, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The hushed, venomous gossip drifted through the crisp evening air. I always knew his tech company was a total scam, one neighbor whispered loudly to his wife. Look at him crying like a child, another scoffed, adjusting his phone to get a better camera angle. The social elite have absolutely zero loyalty when the ship starts sinking. They were devouring his public humiliation with eager, predatory delight. Bradley stumbled over the thick roots of the oak tree in the front yard. His expensive leather loafers slipped on the damp grass, leaving dark mud stains on his tailored trousers. He looked entirely pathetic. The flawless manufactured facade he used to manipulate the world had been violently ripped away, leaving nothing but a weak, terrified criminal exposed to the glaring lights of the police cruisers. He had spent years trying to humiliate me, trying to make me feel small and insignificant in my own home. Now he was the primary spectacle in a neighborhood-wide circus of shame. The officers escorted him to the rear door of the lead patrol car. Just as the officer placed a heavy hand on top of his head to guide him into the back seat, Bradley dug his heels deep into the dirt. He planted his feet, refusing to move, and twisted his body around to look back at the porch. His eyes locked onto mine. The arrogant, wealthy man who had confidently threatened to throw me into a state-funded psychiatric ward just 24 hours ago completely shattered. He broke down into a loud, agonizing, snot-nosed sob. Tears streamed freely down his pale, flushed face, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. "Milton, please," Bradley screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the sound of the police radios. "Please, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them you gave me the keys. Tell them I had your permission to sell the car. I will pay you back every single cent. I will give you whatever you want. Do not let them take me to jail. Please, Milton, I am begging you." He was openly weeping, utilizing every ounce of his supposed upper-class privilege to plead for mercy. He expected me to cave. He expected the quiet, dutiful father-in-law to step forward and shield him from the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. I did not move a single muscle. I stood tall on my porch, my hands resting calmly in my trouser pockets. I looked down at him with a gaze made of absolute, unforgiving ice. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried clearly across the quiet, tense lawn. "You sold my car, Bradley," I stated, my tone devoid of any human sympathy. "Now you pay the toll." The lead officer did not wait for another response. He shoved Bradley's head down forcefully and pushed him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the patrol car. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a sharp, echoing finality that signaled the absolute end of Bradley's freedom. The police officers climbed into the front seats of their vehicles. The engines roared to life and the sirens blared once again, a deafening screech that drowned out the neighborhood gossip. The convoy of cruisers quickly reversed out of my driveway and sped off down the dark suburban street, their flashing lights slowly fading into the distance until they disappeared completely. A heavy, ringing silence settled over the property. The neighbors, realizing the main event was officially over, slowly lowered their phones and dispersed back into their expensive homes, eagerly preparing to upload their videos to the internet. I turned around and walked back into the house. Mr. Gallagher nodded to me once, a silent acknowledgement of a perfectly executed strategy, before stepping out the front door to handle the impending legal paperwork. I closed the heavy oak door, shutting out the rest of the world. I walked into the foyer. Jada was standing alone in the center of the living room. She was violently shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. Her fraudulent empire had just been obliterated in a matter of minutes. The money was gone. Her husband was on his way to a federal holding cell, and she was finally trapped alone with the father she had relentlessly tried to destroy. I stepped into the foyer, my tailored suit perfectly crisp against the backdrop of the ruined, demolished living room Jada had created. The silence between us was heavy, broken only by the sound of Jada's ragged, uneven breathing. She looked around the room, taking in the shattered crystal champagne glasses, the stripped walls, the absolute wreckage of her fraudulent dream. Then she looked at me. The icy, condescending glare she had worn like a crown for months completely melted away. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the fabric of her expensive designer dress pooling around her. She crawled across the distance between us, her perfectly manicured hands reaching out until she latched onto my pant legs. "Daddy," she wailed, her voice a pathetic, guttural sob that echoed through the empty house. "Daddy, please. You have to help me. You have to stop this. I am your daughter. I am your only child. You cannot let them do this to me." She buried her face against my knees, her tears soaking into the fabric of my trousers. She sounded exactly like the frightened little girl who used to run to me when there was a thunderstorm. But I knew better. This was not the genuine cry of a repentant child. This was the desperate, calculated manipulation of a cornered predator realizing the trap had completely snapped shut. I did not move. I looked down at the top of her head, feeling absolutely nothing. No warmth, no pity, no paternal instinct to reach down and comfort her. The woman weeping at my feet had deliberately tried to strip away my human rights, forge my signature, and throw me into a locked psychiatric ward so she could steal my life savings to buy more luxury handbags. She looked up at me. Her makeup completely ruined her eyes wide with manufactured terror. "Please, Daddy." Bradley made me do it. He pressured me. He told me it was the only way to save our reputation. "I did not want to hurt you. I love you. You are my flesh and blood. You promised Mom you would always protect me. You cannot let me go to prison." Hearing her use Loretta's name to shield herself from the consequences of her own horrific crimes was the final nail in the coffin. A surge of cold, immovable resolve hardened every muscle in my body. I reached down, grabbed her wrists with a firm, unyielding grip, and forcefully peeled her manicured fingers off my legs. I stepped backward, creating a vast, undeniable physical and emotional distance between us. "Do not ever speak your mother's name to me again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made her flinch. "Your mother would be entirely sickened by the monster sitting on my floor." Jada stayed on her knees, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for another manipulative angle, another string to pull, but the puppet master had cut all the strings. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she heard and understood every single syllable of my next sentence. "Do you remember the night of your anniversary party, Jada?" I asked, my tone deadly calm. "Do you remember standing on that stage in your diamond necklace staring down at the father who broke his back to give you everything? You tore my honest gift into pieces. You threw it at my chest. You looked at me with absolute disgust and you told me I was a joke. You commanded me to never embarrass you again." Jada squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing violently, finally realizing that I had never forgotten, and I had certainly never forgiven. "Well, Jada," I continued, my voice echoing off the torn drywall of the living room, "look around you. Look at your husband sitting in the back of a police cruiser. Look at your frozen bank accounts. Look at your shattered reputation. You said I was a joke, but you are the punchline to that comedy. You told me just yesterday morning to learn my place. You told me I was a liability to your image. Now I am telling you to learn your place. Your place is no longer in my house. Your place is no longer in my life. You are completely and entirely cut off." Right on cue, the heavy front door swung open once again. Mr. Gallagher stepped back into the foyer, followed immediately by 4 large men wearing black tactical uniforms. This was the elite private security firm Gallagher had kept on standby just down the street. The men fanned out across the living room, their presence an imposing silent threat. Jada scrambled backward, her eyes darting between the security guards and me. "What is happening?" she cried out, clutching her designer purse against her chest. I turned to the lead security officer. "Clear this property of all unauthorized belongings," I commanded firmly. "Everything this woman brought into my house goes out to the curb immediately." The security team moved with terrifying efficiency. 2 of the men marched directly into the master bedroom. Within seconds, they were carrying out Jada's expensive imported suitcases, her racks of designer clothing, her velvet shoe boxes, and her absurd luxury handbags. They did not handle the items with care. They carried them out the front door and began tossing them aggressively onto the dark, damp grass of the front lawn. Jada scrambled to her feet, screaming hysterically as she watched thousands of dollars of stolen merchandise being thrown onto the dirt. "Stop it!" she shrieked, lunging toward one of the guards. "Those are mine! You are ruining them!" The lead security officer easily stepped into her path, raising a massive hand to halt her progress. "Ma'am, you need to exit the premises immediately," he stated with a booming, non-negotiable voice. "If you resist, you will be detained for criminal trespassing and handed over to the local police department." I stood in the doorway and watched as the security team physically escorted my daughter out of my house. She stumbled down the porch steps, her expensive heels sinking deep into the muddy soil of the front yard. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a loud, satisfying click. I was finally alone in my own home. Outside, in the crisp, cool night, Jada collapsed onto the concrete sidewalk. She was surrounded by a scattered, pathetic mountain of her designer luggage and luxury handbags. The flashing police lights were gone, leaving her in the harsh, unforgiving glow of the street lamp. She frantically dug into her purse and pulled out her smartphone. She needed a lifeline. She needed a place to stay. She scrolled desperately through her contacts, dialing the numbers of the wealthy high society friends who had eagerly drank her champagne and laughed at my expense just weeks prior. She dialed the first number. It rang once and went straight to a generic voicemail. She dialed a second. The call dropped immediately. She dialed a third, a fourth, a fifth. Every single prominent socialite she called had already seen the neighborhood videos of Bradley being hauled away in handcuffs. The rumor mill of the elite circle had moved with lightning speed. They knew the money was gone. They knew the federal authorities were involved. And in their ruthless world, poverty and scandal were highly contagious diseases. Jada sat alone on the cold, hard curb in the dead of night, staring at her glowing phone screen. Every single number she dialed had completely blocked her. The wheels of federal justice turned with terrifying speed. 3 months after that night on the curb, we all found ourselves inside a massive downtown federal courthouse. The trial was incredibly brief. It was not a battle of legal strategy or persuasive arguments. It was a complete and total slaughter. Mr. Gallagher sat calmly beside me in the gallery while the federal prosecutor took the floor. The prosecution did not need to perform any theatrics. They simply dimmed the courtroom lights and pressed play. The high-definition videos from my basement played on the large monitors for the entire jury to see. There was Bradley handing the forged vehicle title to the exotic car broker. There was the corrupt doctor accepting $10,000 in a thick white envelope to officially declare me mentally incompetent. The defense attorneys sat at their tables in absolute silence. They offered no objections. They had no counter-arguments against the crystal-clear audio and video evidence playing right in front of them. The evidence was absolute. The federal judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. Bradley stood before the bench wearing a wrinkled orange jumpsuit. He was a hollow, trembling shell of the arrogant tech executive he once pretended to be. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel and sentenced Bradley to 8 years in a federal penitentiary for bank fraud, grand theft auto, and wire fraud. The corrupt doctor who sold his medical oath for a quick cash payout was permanently stripped of his medical license and indicted on severe felony bribery charges. He was hauled out of the courtroom in steel handcuffs right behind Bradley. Then came Jada. She stood before the judge looking thin, exhausted, and utterly defeated. Because she had not directly forged the vehicle title or orchestrated the commercial lease fraud, she narrowly escaped a lengthy prison sentence. But the judge ensured her punishment was a living nightmare. She was sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation. The court officially declared her completely bankrupt. Every single luxury handbag, designer dress, and piece of imported jewelry was seized by the government and auctioned off to pay restitution to the defrauded commercial bank. To fulfill her heavily mandated community service, the judge ordered her to perform rigorous manual labor. The woman who once mocked my calloused hands and my honest work was now legally required to scrub public city restrooms and collect highway trash wearing a bright orange safety vest. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom before Jada could even turn around to look at me. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me with a satisfying thud. The courthouse steps were swarming with local reporters and news crews desperate for a comment on the dramatic downfall of the fake tech billionaire and his socialite wife. I ignored their flashing cameras and their shouted questions. I pushed through the crowd and stepped out onto the open sidewalk. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp city air. I stood tall, my shoulders finally relaxed, and my dignity completely restored. I returned to my house on Oakwood Drive with a renewed sense of purpose. The very first thing I did was hire a local junk removal crew. I stood in the living room with my arms crossed and watched with immense satisfaction as they hauled away every single piece of flashy imported Italian furniture Jada had purchased with my stolen equity. The chaotic modern art, the ridiculous velvet chairs, the oversized glass tables all went straight into the back of a garbage truck where they belonged. Once the house was completely emptied of their hollow, materialistic garbage, I breathed new life into the space. I restored the original hardwood floors, brought my comfortable armchair up from the basement, and hung Loretta's favorite landscape paintings back on the walls. The house was finally a home again. With my peace fully restored, I focused on what true wealth was actually meant for. I did not need millions of dollars sitting idle in a corporate trust, and I certainly was not going to leave a single dime to my ungrateful daughter. I took a significant portion of the capital held within the Apex Blind Trust and officially established the Loretta Foundation. I specifically designed this initiative to support disadvantaged African American youth in our local community. Instead of handing out free checks, I used the foundation to build a comprehensive vocational training center. We brought in master carpenters, electricians, and plumbers to teach these young men and women the honorable trades of the construction industry. I wanted to give them the exact same tools and skills I used to build my own life from the ground up, teaching them the profound value of hard work so they could proudly stand on their own 2 feet without ever relying on anyone else. It has been 6 months since the trial ended. This morning I woke up early just as the sun began to rise over the quiet suburban street. I poured myself a hot cup of black coffee and walked out onto my front porch. I sat down in my wooden rocking chair listening to the gentle morning breeze rustling through the oak trees. I looked out at the garden beds lining the walkway. The vibrant red and yellow flowers that Loretta had planted decades ago were blooming beautifully, their colors brighter than I had seen in years. My enemies had been thoroughly dismantled, my legacy was permanently secured, and my dignity remained completely intact. I took a long, peaceful sip of my coffee, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of calm. That is my story. Greed always carries a devastating price, and those who attempt to build their castles on the backs of others will inevitably watch their empires crumble into dust. What would you do if you were in my shoes? How would you handle a family member who crossed the ultimate line? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Looking back on this entire ordeal, the greatest lesson I learned is that true power does not roar, it observes. People blinded by arrogance will always mistake silence for weakness and patience for stupidity. Jada and Bradley thought their expensive clothes and loud demands made them completely untouchable. They forgot that the strongest foundations are built quietly, brick by brick, deep below the surface. When you let your actions speak instead of your anger, you give your enemies the exact silence they need to utterly destroy themselves. Never let anyone, not even your own blood, convince you that your honest life is something to be ashamed of. Share this video with someone who needs a firm reminder to stand their ground and never let anyone diminish their true worth.